Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that's been romanticised, glorified and completely misunderstood by every medieval fantasy novel, video game and Renaissance fair you've ever attended. The life of a medieval knight. Not the shining hero on a white horse who saves princesses and slays dragons. I mean the real knight. The guy whose armour gave him heat stroke, whose horse cost more than his house, and who spent most of his time getting pummeled by other sweaty men in metal suits while trying not to drown in his own helmet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's pause and ask ourselves some questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to wear 60 pounds of metal in the summer heat? Did knights really rescue damsels, or were they mostly just collecting tolls and beating up peasants? What did they eat when they weren't at fancy banquets? How did they go to the bathroom in full armour? Could you survive a jousting match without throwing up inside your helmet? Would you make it through a single day of training without accidentally stabbing yourself with your own sword? And when you finally earned your knighthood after years of servitude, would you realise the whole thing was basically an expensive, painful scam run by people who already had castles? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1215. You're 15 years old, your back already hurts, and you're wearing someone else's hand-me-down chainmail that smells like a dead goat. Welcome to knighthood. It's going to be a long, uncomfortable, financially ruinous ride. Let's get one thing straight right from the start. Everything you think you know about knights is wrong. Hollywood lied to you. Video games lied to you. That Renaissance fair you went to last summer, also lying. The popular image of the knight, noble, chivalrous, riding into battle with a glorious sense of purpose, is about as accurate as expecting a medieval surgeon to understand antibiotics. In reality, knights were a very specific class of heavily armed, often broke, occasionally illiterate soldiers, whose main job was to fight for rich people, collect taxes from poor people, and occasionally show up at tournaments to get concussed for entertainment. The word knight comes from the Old English word knight, which originally just meant servant or boy. Not exactly the heroic origin story you were expecting, is it? And that's because knighthood, at its core, was about service. You served a lord. That lord served a higher lord. And everyone served the king, who supposedly served God, though God didn't seem to weigh in much on the day-to-day tax collection and peasant oppression. In the early medieval period, around the 9th and 10th centuries, knights weren't even particularly special. They were just soldiers who could afford a horse and some basic armour. The horse was the key part. Cavalry was expensive, and if you could show up to battle mounted and armed, you were valuable. But you weren't noble, you weren't elite, you were just a guy with a horse doing a dangerous job for someone richer than you. It wasn't until later, around the 11th and 12th centuries, that knighthood started to get romanticised. The church got involved, trying to channel all that violent energy into something vaguely Christian. Suddenly, knights were supposed to be warriors of God, protecting the weak and fighting for justice. Poets started writing songs about brave knights rescuing damsels and slaying dragons. The whole chivalric code got invented. Courtesy, honour, bravery, loyalty. It sounded beautiful on parchment. In practice, most knights ignored it completely, because knighthood wasn't about honour, it was about land, power and money. If you were a younger son of a noble family, you became a knight because you weren't inheriting anything. Your older brother got the estate, you got a sword, a horse, and a polite suggestion to go make your fortune somewhere else. And making your fortune usually meant finding a lord to serve, fighting in his wars and hoping he'd reward you with a small piece of land so you could stop sleeping in barns. Even the famous Knights of the Round Table, the ultimate symbol of chivalric perfection, were a fantasy. King Arthur probably didn't exist. Camelot definitely didn't exist. And the knights who supposedly gathered there to discuss honour and justice? Pure fiction, written centuries later by French poets who had never swung a sword in their lives. It was medieval fan fiction, and people ate it up because the truth was far less appealing. The truth was that knights were part of a feudal system designed to keep power concentrated at the top. You, as a knight, or a middle manager in a violent pyramid scheme. You swore loyalty to a lord in exchange for land or payment. That lord swore loyalty to a duke or a king, and everyone below you, the peasants, the serfs, the farmers, worked the land and gave you a cut of everything they produced. You didn't ask their permission. You didn't pay them fairly. You just took, because that was the system, and if they complained you had a sword and they didn't. Your actual day-to-day life as a knight wasn't spent rescuing anyone. It was spent enforcing your lord's will. That might mean collecting taxes from villages, breaking up disputes between peasants, or riding out to intimidate a neighbouring lord who was getting too ambitious. Sometimes it meant actual warfare, raiding enemy territory, burning crops, besieging castles. But even in war, you weren't some lone hero charging into battle. You were part of a unit surrounded by other knights, foot soldiers, and archers, all trying not to die while completing whatever objective your lord had decided was worth killing for. And let's talk about the economics of knighthood, because this is where the whole myth really falls apart. Being a knight was expensive, ruinously expensive. A full suit of armour could cost as much as a small farm. A good warhorse could cost as much as several farms. Weapons, repairs, equipment, feeding yourself and your horse. It all added up fast. If you didn't own land, you were constantly scrambling to make enough money to stay afloat. Many knights were basically broke, surviving on the generosity of their lord or the occasional ransom payment from a captured enemy. This is why tournaments became so popular. They were a way for knights to show off their skills, win prizes, and maybe catch the attention of a wealthy patron. But they were also expensive to enter, dangerous to compete in, and more often than not you'd walk away with nothing but bruises and broken equipment. The whole system was designed to keep you dependent, striving, and just desperate enough to keep fighting. The chivalric code, that beautiful ideal of knightly behaviour, was mostly a marketing tool. It made knights sound noble and justified their position in society. We're not just armed thugs, the code seemed to say. We're protectors. We're honourable. We follow rules. But the rules were vague and self-serving. Protect the weak? Sure, as long as they're on your side. Show mercy to enemies? Only if they're rich enough to ransom. Be courteous to ladies. As long as those ladies are noble women, not peasant girls who had no legal protections and no recourse if a knight decided to abuse his power. The reality was that knighthood was a job, and like most jobs, it involved a lot of tedious, unpleasant work punctuated by brief moments of terror. You weren't a hero. You were a cog in a feudal machine, grinding along until you either died in battle, got too old to fight, or, if you were very, very lucky, managed to secure enough land and status to retire in relative comfort. And yet, despite all of this, the myth persists. We still love the image of the knight in shining armour, the noble warrior riding off to save the day. It's a powerful fantasy, but that's all it is. A fantasy. The real knights were sweaty, tired, often scared, and almost always in debt. They wore dented armour that didn't quite fit. They rode horses that were mean and expensive. And they fought not for glory, but because someone richer than them told them to. So the next time you see a knight in a movie, standing tall and heroic with a gleaming sword and a determined expression, just remember, the real version of that guy probably smelled like a barn, owed money to half the kingdom, and was one bad joust away from financial ruin. Welcome to knighthood. It's not what you thought it was. You didn't just wake up one day and decide to become a knight. You couldn't take a weekend course or fill out an application. Becoming a knight was a decades-long process that started when you were about 7 years old and ended, if you were lucky, sometime in your 20s. First, you were sent away from home to serve as a page in some lord's household, where you learned how to carry things, pour wine, and not make eye contact. Then you graduated to squire, which meant you got to carry heavier things, clean armour, and occasionally hold someone's horse while they went off to do something heroic without you. Let's start at the beginning. You're 7 years old, maybe 8 if your parents were feeling sentimental, but probably 7. At an age when modern kids are learning multiplication tables and losing teeth, you were being shipped off to live with strangers. Your parents didn't ask if you wanted to go. This wasn't a discussion. If you were born into a noble family, especially as a younger son, this was your path. Your older brother would inherit the land. You would become a knight, or die trying. The family you were sent to wasn't chosen randomly. Your father had connections, political alliances, old friendships, debts owed or called in. You'd be sent to serve a lord who was either more powerful than your father or politically useful to him. Maybe it was your uncle. Maybe it was a Count 3 territories over. Either way, you were now that lord's problem, and he was now yours. As a page, your job was essentially to be a well-bred servant. You carried messages. You served food at banquets, trying not to spill wine on anyone important. You learned table manners, which in the medieval world meant not wiping your mouth on the tablecloth and knowing which knife to use for which course. You were taught to read and write, though only if your lord valued education. Many didn't. Literacy was optional, obedience was not. You also started learning the basics of combat, but not in the exciting way. No one handed you a sword and said, "Go wild." You practiced with wooden sticks. You learned footwork, balance, how to hold a shield without dropping it. Older pages, squires, and knights would correct you, sometimes with words, often with a swift smack to remind you that mistakes had consequences. Welcome to medieval pedagogy. Strict, physical, and utterly unconcerned with your feelings. The living conditions weren't great either. You slept in a shared room with other pages, on a straw mattress that was probably infested with something. You woke up early, often before dawn, because the lord's household ran on a strict schedule, and you were the lowest person in it. You ate leftovers from the previous night's meal. You wore hand-me-down clothes. And you did all of this while desperately trying not to embarrass your family, because if you screwed up badly enough, you'd be sent home in disgrace, and your father would never forgive you. This went on for years, 7, 8, 9 years of carrying goblets, memorizing courtly etiquette, and learning how to bow at precisely the right angle. It was boring. It was repetitive. It was designed to break you down and rebuild you into someone who could serve without question. And if you survived it without running away or getting kicked out, you eventually became a squire. Becoming a squire, usually around age 14, was technically a promotion. You were no longer the lowest-ranking servant in the household. Now you were the lowest-ranking military servant, which was different but not necessarily better. Your primary job as a squire was to serve a specific knight, not the lord of the house. He had his own squires. You were assigned to one of the household knights, and from that moment on, your life revolved around him. You dressed him in the morning. You polished his armour, which was a never-ending job because metal rusts, dents, and collects grime faster than you can imagine. You sharpened his weapons. You fed and groomed his horse, which was a massive, aggressive animal bred for war and utterly uninterested in your safety. You carried his equipment to training, to tournaments, to battles. And if he needed something in the middle of the night, a drink, a fresh shirt, someone to complain to, congratulations that someone was you. But squireship wasn't just about servitude. This was when your real training began. You practiced with actual weapons now, swords, lances, maces, axes. You learned to fight on foot and on horseback. You sparred with other squires, and those fights were brutal. No one was holding back. Broken noses, split lips, bruised ribs, all part of the learning process. You were expected to take the hits, get up, and keep going. Complaining was for peasants. You also started accompanying your knight into actual combat. Not as a fighter, not yet. You were there to assist. If his lance broke, you handed him a new one. If he was unhorsed, you helped him up, assuming you weren't also being attacked. If he took a prisoner, you guarded that prisoner, and if he was injured or killed, well, you did your best to drag his body off the field before someone looted it. It was terrifying, chaotic, an excellent motivation to get better at fighting so you wouldn't end up as someone else's squire someday. The training was relentless. You practiced swordplay until your arms felt like they were going to fall off. You rode horses for hours, learning how to control a massive animal in the chaos of battle while wearing armour and holding a 10-foot lance. You learned wrestling, because if you got knocked off your horse and lost your weapon, hand-to-hand combat was your only option. You studied tactics, at least in theory, how to position yourself in a charge, how to break an enemy line, how to recognise when a battle was lost and it was time to retreat before you got killed. And through all of this, you were still a servant. You still cleaned armour. You still slept in whatever corner of the castle or tent was available. You still ate after everyone else. The only difference was that now you were also expected to risk your life on a regular basis. This continued for another 7 to 10 years. You went from 14 to your early 20s, if you lived that long, watching knights fight, learning from their successes and their mistakes, and waiting for your moment. Some squires never became knights. They died in battle. They were too poor to afford the ceremony. They fell out of favour with their lord. Or they simply weren't good enough, and after a certain age it became clear they never would be. But if you survived, if you proved yourself in battle or a tournament, if you had the money and the connections, you finally reached the end of the road, your lord would decide you were ready. A date would be set. Preparations would be made. And after 15 plus years of servitude, violence and humiliation, you'd kneel in front of a lord, get tapped on the shoulder with a sword, and hear the words that changed everything. Arise, Sir Knight. Except now you were broke, exhausted, and responsible for buying all your own equipment. But hey, at least you had a title. And that's assuming the ceremony didn't bankrupt you first. Training to become a knight was less learning the blade, and more getting repeatedly hit with sticks by older, angrier men until you stopped crying. Your daily routine involved sparring with weapons that could actually hurt you, lifting heavy objects to build muscle you desperately need later, and riding horses for hours until your thighs felt like they'd been tenderized by a medieval meat hammer. There were no participation trophies. If you were too slow, you got whacked. If you complained, you got whacked harder. And if you cried, well, congratulations. You just earned yourself another month of whacking. The training began early. Before the sun came up, you were already awake, stumbling out into the cold courtyard in whatever clothes you'd slept in. Morning exercises started immediately, running laps around the castle grounds, doing pull-ups on wooden beams, carrying heavy stones from one end of the yard to the other for no reason except to build strength and teach you that life was suffering. Modern gym memberships have nothing on medieval knight training. You didn't get to choose your workout, you didn't get rest days. You just did what you were told until your muscles screamed and your lungs burned. Then came weapons practice, and this is where things got painful. You started with wooden swords, which sounds harmless until you realise that a wooden sword swung hard enough can break bones. You practiced basic strikes, overhead cuts, diagonal slashes, thrusts, over and over and over again. Hundreds of repetitions. Thousands. Your arms ached. Your grip blistered. But you kept going, because the moment you slowed down, someone older and stronger would step in and remind you, with a sharp crack to your ribs, that hesitation got you killed. You also practiced with a sword and shield, which was harder than it looked. The shield wasn't just for blocking, it was a weapon. You learned to bash with it, shove enemies off balance, use it to create openings for your sword. But shields were heavy, awkward and exhausting to hold up for more than a few minutes. Your shoulder would burn, your arm would tremble. And if you dropped your shield during practice, you'd be fighting without it for the rest of the session, while everyone else took turns hitting you. Polearms came next. Spears, halberds, glaives, long weapons designed to keep enemies at a distance. These required completely different techniques. Footwork became critical. Timing became everything. You had to learn how to thrust, parry and swing a 10-foot pole without tripping over it or accidentally hitting your allies. And because medieval training didn't believe in safe spaces, you practiced with real weapons, or at least weapons sharp enough to do real damage if you screwed up. Then there was the quintain. This was a training device designed to teach you how to joust without actually killing anyone. Picture a wooden post with a rotating crossbar. On one end, a shield or a target. On the other end, a heavy sandbag. You'd ride at it full speed with a lance, trying to hit the target dead center. If you hit it wrong, the whole thing would spin around, and the sandbag would smack you in the back of the head, knocking you clean off your horse. It was humiliating, painful, and incredibly effective at teaching you to keep your lance steady and your aim true. Horseback combat was an entirely different nightmare. Riding a horse is hard enough. Riding a horse while wearing armour, holding a lance and trying to hit a moving target, nearly impossible at first. You fell off, a lot. Knights in training spent more time on the ground than in the saddle during the early years. Your horse would bolt, you'd lose your balance, the lance would slip, and down you'd go, crashing into the dirt while everyone else laughed and told you to get back up. The horses themselves were part of the challenge. War horses weren't gentle, obedient animals. They were aggressive, powerful, and trained to fight. They'd bite. They'd kick. They'd rear up unexpectedly if something spooked them. Learning to control one required strength, confidence, and a healthy amount of fear. You had to dominate the horse without breaking its spirit because in battle, you needed that aggression. But if you couldn't control it, that same aggression would get you killed. Wrestling and grappling were also essential skills. If you lost your weapon in battle, or if you ended up on the ground in close quarters, you needed to know how to fight with your hands. Medieval wrestling was brutal. No rules, no referee, just two people trying to choke, pin, or break each other. You learned joint locks, throws, how to escape from holds, and how to use your opponent's armor against them, grabbing someone's helmet and wrenching their neck, jamming a dagger into the gap under their armpit. This wasn't sport. It was survival. And let's not forget endurance training. You didn't just need to be strong, you needed stamina. Battles lasted for hours. Tournaments could go all day. If you ran out of energy halfway through, you were done. So your trainers made you run while wearing armor, swim in full chainmail, fight practice duels that went on until someone collapsed. It was exhausting, miserable, and designed to push you past every limit you thought you had. Pain was a constant companion. Bruises covered your arms and legs. Your knuckles were perpetually split. Your shins were black and blue from getting kicked during grappling practice. You'd take a sword pommel to the face and spend the rest of the day spitting blood. You'd get thrown from your horse and limp for a week. But you couldn't stop. Showing weakness meant losing respect, and in a world where respect was currency, you couldn't afford to lose it. There was also a psychological component to the training. You were being conditioned to obey without question, to suppress fear, and to keep fighting even when every instinct told you to run. Your trainers would scream at you, insult you, tell you that you were worthless, slow, weak, and destined to die in your first real battle. It was brutal, demoralizing, and entirely intentional. They wanted to break you down so they could rebuild you into someone who wouldn't freeze when a man with an axe was charging at you. Some boys didn't make it. They quit, ran away, or got injured so badly they couldn't continue. Broken arms, shattered legs, concussions that left them dazed for weeks. These were common enough that nobody was particularly surprised when someone didn't show up for training one day. There was no workers' compensation, no medical leave. You either healed up and got back to it, or you were done. The ones who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the most stubborn. The ones who could take a beating and come back for more. The ones who learned to ignore pain, push through exhaustion, and keep their heads clear even when everything hurt. Because that's what being a knight required. Not brilliance, not talent, but the sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. And after years of this, after thousands of hours of getting hit, falling off horses, and dragging yourself out of bed with bruised ribs and aching joints, you finally became competent. Not great, not a master, just competent enough to survive your first real battle, which honestly was the best you could hope for. After roughly 15 years of servitude, humiliation, and blunt force trauma, you finally reached the end. The knighting ceremony. This was supposed to be the proudest moment of your life. You knelt before your lord. He tapped you on the shoulder with a sword, muttered some Latin you didn't understand, and boom! You were a knight. Except now you were also broke. Because becoming a knight required you to buy your own armor, your own weapons, your own horse, and throw a feast for everyone who came to watch you get dubbed. It was like graduating from college and immediately going into debt for a degree you'd never actually use. Let's talk about the expenses first, because they were staggering. You couldn't become a knight in borrowed armor or riding your master's spare horse. You needed your own equipment, and that equipment had to be impressive. A full suit of mail armor could cost as much as a decent farm. A proper war horse, a destrier bred specifically for combat, could cost even more. Then there were weapons. A sword, a lance, a dagger, maybe a mace or an axe. Each one had to be well made because cheap weapons broke in battle and got you killed. If you were the eldest son of a wealthy lord, this wasn't a problem. Your father would cover the costs, proud to see his boy join the ranks of knighthood. But if you were a younger son, or the son of a minor noble, or heaven forbid a commoner who'd somehow clawed his way up through exceptional service, you were on your own. You'd have to borrow money, sell whatever you owned, or hope that your lord felt generous enough to help. Most didn't. and the ceremony itself wasn't cheap either. Tradition demanded that you host a feast, not a small gathering with bread and cheese, a proper feast with multiple courses, roasted meats, imported wine, musicians, and entertainment. You were expected to invite everyone of importance in the region, other knights, local nobility, clergy, your lord's entire household. Showing up with anything less than abundance would be seen as an insult, a sign that you weren't really worthy of the title. The night before the ceremony, you were supposed to participate in a ritual bath. This wasn't just about getting clean, though God knows you probably needed it after years of living in training camps. The bath was symbolic, a cleansing of your old life, a preparation for your new role as a warrior of God. You'd be washed by senior knights or attendants, dressed in clean white robes, and then sent to a chapel to keep vigil. The vigil was an all-night affair. You knelt alone in a dark chapel, praying, reflecting on your duties, and contemplating the oaths you were about to swear. No sleeping, no sitting down, just you, the cold stone floor, and hours of silence broken only by your own thoughts and the occasional creak of the building. It was supposed to be a spiritual experience, a moment of deep introspection before you took on the mantle of knighthood. In reality, it was uncomfortable, boring, and by hour 3, your knees were screaming and you were fighting to stay awake. When dawn finally came, you were exhausted, stiff, and probably questioning all your life choices. But there was no backing out now. You'd be dressed in your new armour. Hopefully it fit, because armour sizing was more art than science, and led to wherever the ceremony was taking place. Usually the great hall of your lord's castle, sometimes a church, occasionally outdoors if the weather cooperated, and your lord wanted to make a spectacle of it. The ceremony itself was surprisingly brief considering how much build-up there was. You knelt before your lord. He'd say a few words about duty, honour and service. A priest might bless you, sprinkling holy water and invoking God's protection. Then came the moment. Your lord would take his sword and tap you on each shoulder, sometimes on the head, while speaking the words that made it official. I dub thee knight. That was it. 15 years of preparation for a 10-second ritual. In some regions there was an additional tradition called the kole, a hard slap or punch to the face, meant to be the last insult you'd ever accept without retaliation. Because now you were a knight, and striking you was striking a member of the warrior class, which came with serious consequences. The symbolism was clear. You were no longer a boy to be pushed around. You were a man with a sword and the legal right to defend your honour violently. After the ceremony, you were officially Sir So-and-so. You'd be given your spurs, the physical symbol of knighthood, which were strapped to your boots. Gold spurs if you were wealthy, plain metal if you weren't. You'd also receive a sword belt, often presented by a lady of the court in a ceremony that was probably more awkward than romantic. She'd tie it around your waist while everyone watched and tried not to snicker. Then came the feast you'd bankrupted yourself to provide. Tables overflowing with food you couldn't afford. Wine flowing freely. Musicians playing. Everyone eating, drinking, and celebrating your achievement while you sat there doing mental math, calculating exactly how much debt you'd just taken on. The feast could last for hours, sometimes stretching into a second day if your lord was in a particularly festive mood. And here's the cruel irony. The moment the feast ended, your responsibilities as a knight began. You now owed military service to your lord. If he called, you had to show up, fully equipped, ready to fight. No excuses. Sick? Come anyway. Poor? Shouldn't have spent all your money on the feast. Your horse died? Better find a new one fast. The title of knight came with obligations, and those obligations didn't care about your financial situation. Many newly dubbed knights found themselves in an impossible position. They'd gone into debt to afford the ceremony, but they needed to fight in wars or tournaments to earn money, and fighting required expensive equipment that they'd already mortgaged themselves to buy. It was a vicious cycle. Some managed to break free by distinguishing themselves in battle and earning grants of land from their lord. Others spent their entire careers broke, borrowing from moneylenders and hoping the next ransom payment would be enough to cover their debts. There was also the social pressure. You were a knight now. You were expected to act like one. That meant dressing well, maintaining your equipment, keeping servants, hosting guests, and generally living beyond your means to maintain appearances. Because if you looked poor, people assumed you were a bad knight, unsuccessful in battle, unfavoured by your lord, not worth allying with. Your reputation was everything, and your reputation required money you didn't have. Some knights tried to solve this problem through marriage. Find a wealthy heiress, preferably one whose father was desperate enough to overlook your empty coin purse. If you could secure a good marriage, you'd gain a dowry, possibly land and financial stability. But competition for heiresses was fierce, and if you were a newly minted knight with no lands, no wealth, and nothing to offer except a title and a nice set of spurs, your chances weren't great. So there you stood, freshly knighted, armoured, sworn, and absolutely terrified of what came next. Because the ceremony was over, the feast was finished, and now you had to actually be a knight. You had to fight. You had to win. You had to prove that all those years of training, all that money spent, all that suffering endured had been worth it. And if you failed, well, there was no refund policy on knighthood. You were a knight now, for better or worse, mostly worse. But at least you had a cool title. Let's talk about armour, not the gleaming, perfectly fitted suits you see in museums. I mean the real stuff. The heavy, hot, poorly ventilated metal prison you had to strap onto your body every time you went into battle. A full suit of plate armour weighed anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you realise you had to wear it while riding a horse, swinging a sword and trying not to pass out from heat exhaustion. And it wasn't like modern athletic gear designed for breathability and movement. This was metal. It didn't breathe. It trapped heat like a convection oven, and you were the roast. First, let's clarify what we're talking about when we say armour, because it evolved significantly over the medieval period. Early knights, around the 11th and 12th centuries, wore mail armour, thousands of tiny metal rings linked together to form a flexible shirt called a hauberk. Mail was effective against slashing weapons, relatively flexible, and would absolutely destroy your shoulders after wearing it for a few hours. Because while 50 pounds might not sound like much when it's distributed across your whole body, when it's all hanging from your shoulders and neck, it felt like carrying a small person on your back all day. Mail also had a nasty habit of not stopping everything. A sword slash? Fine, the rings would catch it. An arrow? Maybe, depending on the angle and the quality of the mail. A heavy mace or warhammer crushing down on you? The mail wouldn't break, but your bones absolutely would. The impact would transfer right through the rings into your body, turning your ribs into powder and your skull into a cracked eggshell. So mail kept you from getting cut, but it didn't keep you from getting pulverised. By the 14th and 15th centuries, plate armour became the standard for knights who could afford it. This was the classic knight in shining armour look. Solid metal plates covering your entire body, articulated at the joints, custom fitted to your frame. It was significantly better protection than mail. Arrows would bounce off. Swords would skitter across the surface. You were basically a walking tank. But here's what they don't tell you in the fantasy novels. Plate armour was absolutely miserable to wear. Let's start with the heat. Metal conducts temperature beautifully, which means in summer, your armour absorbed every bit of sunlight and radiated it directly into your body. You weren't just hot. You were being slowly cooked. Knights fighting in the Crusades, wearing full armour in the desert heat, would pass out from heat stroke. Some died. Not from combat. Just from being too stubborn or too dutiful to take off their armour in 100-degree weather. Winter wasn't much better. Cold metal against your skin, even through layers of padding, was a special kind of torture. Your armour would leach the warmth right out of your body. Your fingers would go numb inside your gauntlets. Your breath would condense inside your helmet, creating a lovely layer of frost that would melt and drip down your face as soon as you started moving. And speaking of helmets, let's talk about those for a moment. Early helmets were simple, a basic conical shape, maybe a nose guard. But by the later medieval period, helmets had evolved into elaborate affairs. Visored helms that covered your entire face, great helms that turned your head into a metal bucket, bassinets with articulated visors that could be raised or lowered. They looked impressive. They also turned your head into a sensory deprivation chamber. Visibility inside a closed helmet was terrible. You had a narrow slit or a few small holes to see through. Peripheral vision? Gone. Looking down to see where you were stepping? Nearly impossible. Many knights fought with their visors up just so they could actually see what was happening, which defeated the entire purpose of having face protection in the first place. Hearing was also severely compromised. All sound became muffled, distant, and distorted. In the chaos of battle, with people shouting orders, horses screaming and metal clanging against metal, you could barely make out what was happening around you. Communication was nearly impossible. You couldn't hear your commander's orders. You couldn't hear warnings from your fellow knights. You were functionally deaf, stumbling around in a metal shell, hoping you were hitting enemies and not allies. And then there's the breathing situation. Helmets had ventilation holes, but they were small and insufficient. You'd be sucking in hot, stale air that tasted like metal and your own breath. During heavy exertion, running, fighting, climbing, you'd be gasping, desperate for air that wasn't coming fast enough. Some knights would tear their helmets off mid-battle just to breathe, leaving themselves vulnerable to the exact head injuries the helmet was supposed to prevent. The weight distribution was another nightmare. Yes, armour was designed to distribute weight across your body, and a well-fitted suit could be surprisingly mobile. But surprisingly mobile doesn't mean comfortable. It means you could move without immediately collapsing. You could bend, crouch, and even do a somersault if you were particularly athletic and the armour was particularly well made. But every movement required more effort. Your muscles were working against the weight and the resistance of articulated metal plates. After an hour, you were exhausted. After several hours of fighting, you were running on pure adrenaline and the terror of dying. Getting knocked down in full plate armour was a death sentence if you couldn't get back up quickly. Once you were on the ground, you were a turtle on its back, heavy, awkward, and helpless. You needed help to stand, and if help wasn't available because everyone else was also fighting for their lives, you'd be lying there while enemy soldiers stabbed at the gaps in your armour or just bashed your helmet in with a mace. The maintenance was constant and expensive. Armour rusted, it got dented, straps broke, joints seized up. After every use, you, or more likely your squire, had to clean it, oil it, check for damage and make repairs. A single dent in the wrong place could compromise the entire suit. If a plate got bent inward, it could restrict your movement or dig into your skin. If a buckle broke, an entire section might fall off mid-battle. And let's not forget the padding. You couldn't wear plate armour directly against your skin. The metal would chafe, bruise, and cut you. So underneath, you wore an arming doublet, a thick padded jacket with straps and points to attach the armour pieces. Under that, a linen shirt. Sometimes mail underneath the plate for extra protection. By the time you were fully dressed, you were wearing multiple layers of clothing and metal, weighing 70+ pounds, unable to cool down, and sweating profusely into fabric that wouldn't be washed for days. The smell inside a suit of armour after a day of fighting was legendary. Sweat, blood, sometimes urine if you'd been wearing it long enough and nature called at an inopportune moment. The padding would soak it all up, becoming a bacterial breeding ground that sat directly against your skin. Skin infections, rashes and sores were common. Knights would develop permanent calluses and scars from the constant friction of armour against skin. There was also the very real problem of injury from the armour itself. The edges of plates could cut you. Poorly fitted armour could pinch nerves or restrict blood flow. Some knights developed chronic pain in their backs, shoulders and knees from years of bearing the weight. It was a slow, grinding physical toll that left many older knights crippled and arthritic, their bodies permanently damaged by the very equipment that had kept them alive. And after all of this, the expense, the discomfort, the heat, the restricted movement, the constant maintenance, your armour still wasn't invincible. A well-placed warhammer could crumple it. A lance could punch through it. Crossbow bolts fired at close range could penetrate it. Gaps existed at the joints, under the arms, at the neck, and a skilled opponent would aim for those weak points. So yes, armour kept you alive. It was essential, but it was also a prison you wore willingly, a necessary torture that defined knightly existence. You put it on knowing you'd be miserable, and you wore it anyway because the alternative was dying even faster. Welcome to medieval warfare, where your armour protected you and slowly killed you at the same time. You couldn't just throw on your armour like a jacket and head out the door. Getting into a full suit of plate armour required at least one other person, usually your squire, and a solid 20 to 30 minutes of awkward grunting and adjusting. Each piece had to be strapped, buckled, or tied in a very specific order. Start with the legs, then the torso, then the arms, then the helmet. Miss a step, and you'd either be lopsided, unable to move, or accidentally strangling yourself with your own gorget. And if you had to pee halfway through, too bad. You were committed now. The process began with the arming doublet, a padded jacket covered in leather straps called points. These points were essentially medieval laces with metal tips, and they'd be used to attach your armour pieces to your body. Your squire would help you into the doublet, then lace it up the back, because of course you couldn't reach it yourself. The doublet had to fit snugly but not too tight, because you'd be wearing it for hours, and if it restricted your breathing or circulation, you'd pass out. Not a great start to a battle. Next came the sabatons, metal shoes for your feet. These were basically articulated metal plates shaped like shoes, and they were about as comfortable as they sound. Your squire would slide them on, then secure them with buckles or straps. If they were too loose, they'd fall off, too tight, and your feet would go numb within an hour. Finding the sweet spot was an art form, and most squires weren't artists. Then the greaves, metal shin guards that covered your lower legs. These were strapped or buckled onto the outside of your calves. If the straps were too tight, they'd cut off circulation. Too loose, and the greaves would slide down or twist around your leg mid-battle, leaving gaps that an enemy could exploit. Your squire had to get it exactly right, which meant a lot of, "Is that too tight? I don't know, walk around. It feels weird. Everything feels weird. You're wearing metal pants." The cuisses came next, thigh armour. These were secured to your arming doublet using those points we mentioned earlier. Your squire would thread a leather lace through a hole in the cuisse, then through a corresponding hole in the doublet, then tie it off. This had to be done on both thighs, front and back, which meant 4 separate lacing jobs just to get your legs armoured. And if one of the laces broke, which they did frequently, you'd have to stop everything and relace it or risk losing a piece of armour in the middle of combat. Now came the folds and tassets, the skirt-like plates that protected your hips and upper thighs. These hung from your breastplate, which you weren't wearing yet, so they had to be set aside and remembered for later. Forget them, and you'd have a very embarrassing gap in your armour right around your pelvis and groin. Not ideal. The breastplate and backplate were next, and this is where things got heavy. The breastplate was a solid curved piece of steel designed to deflect blows away from your vital organs. Your squire would lift it over your head and settle it onto your torso, then move around behind you to attach the backplate. These 2 pieces were connected by leather straps at the shoulders and sides. Your squire would pull the straps tight, buckle them, and then check to make sure everything was aligned. If the breastplate sat crooked, the whole suit would be unbalanced, and you'd be fighting at an angle all day. Attached to the breastplate were the folds we mentioned earlier, plus the placard, an additional lower breastplate that provided extra protection for your abdomen. All of these pieces overlapped like scales, allowing for some flexibility while maintaining coverage. But they also added weight and restriction. Bending at the waist became difficult. Sitting down was nearly impossible. You were committed to standing or riding for the foreseeable future. The pauldrons came next, shoulder armour. These were probably the most complicated pieces to attach, because they had to allow your arms to move while still protecting one of the most vulnerable parts of your body. Each pauldron was made of multiple articulated plates called lames, connected by leather straps or rivets. Your squire would position the pauldron on your shoulder, then secure it to the breastplate using, you guessed it, more points. Then they'd test your range of motion. Could you lift your arm? Could you swing a sword? If not, adjustments had to be made, which meant untying everything and starting over. The rear braces and van braces, upper and lower arm armour, were strapped on next. Like the leg armour, these were secured both to each other and to the arming doublet. Your squire would work their way down each arm, buckling and lacing, making sure the plates overlapped correctly and that your elbow joint could still bend. This was tedious, fiddly work, and if your squire was having a bad day or you'd been short with them earlier, they might accidentally make things a little too tight. The gauntlets were next. Medieval gauntlets weren't gloves. They were articulated metal hands with individual finger plates. Getting your actual human fingers into these metal tubes required patience, and sometimes swearing. The gauntlets would be tied to the vambraces and then your squire would check that you could still make a fist, grip a sword, and manipulate your fingers enough to hold reins. Dexterity was reduced to maybe 60% of normal, but that was considered acceptable. Now the gorget, a metal collar that protected your neck. This piece was crucial because your neck was one of the few unarmoured areas left, and a blade to the throat would end you instantly. The gorget had to be tight enough to stay in place, but loose enough that you could turn your head and, breathe. Your squire would fasten it carefully, checking that it sat properly and didn't dig into your collarbones. Finally, the helmet. This was the last piece for a reason. Once it was on, you were essentially sealed in. Your squire would lift the helmet and lower it onto your head. If you had a great helm, it would just sit on top of your head and rest on your shoulders, supported by the gorget. If you had a more fitted bassinet or sallet, it would have a chin strap that your squire would buckle under your jaw. Either way, the moment the helmet went on, your world got smaller, darker, and quieter, and that was it. You were fully armoured. 20 to 30 minutes of strapping, buckling, lacing and adjusting, and you were ready to fight. Except now you needed to pee, because of course you did. Adrenaline, nerves, and the fact that you drank water before getting dressed all combined to make your bladder suddenly very insistent. Here's the problem. You couldn't just take the armour off. That would require another 20 minutes and your squire's help, and by the time you were undressed, relieved, and redressed, the battle might be over. So you had a few options. 1. Hold it, and pray the battle didn't last long. 2. Try to manoeuvre the folds and tassets out of the way and relieve yourself while partially armoured, which was awkward and often unsuccessful. 3. Just go in the armour and deal with the consequences later. Many knights chose option 3. It wasn't dignified, but dignity wasn't really a priority when someone was trying to kill you. There was also the very real possibility that something would go wrong during the arming process. A strap would break, a buckle would snap, a lace would tear, your squire would forget a piece or attach something backward. These weren't minor inconveniences, they were potentially fatal errors. A poorly secured pauldron could slip during combat, leaving your shoulder exposed. A loose greave could fall off, leaving your shin vulnerable. Knights had been killed because of wardrobe malfunctions. And all of this assumed you had a competent squire. If your squire was inexperienced, drunk, or just having a bad day, the process could take twice as long and result in armour that fit poorly and restricted your movement even more than usual. Some knights armoured themselves, but this was incredibly difficult, and usually resulted in improperly secured pieces that would cause problems later. Once you were finally armoured and ready, you couldn't just stand around waiting. The armour was exhausting to wear even when you weren't doing anything. Your muscles were constantly working to support the weight and compensate for the restricted movement. If you had to wait an hour for the battle to start, you'd already be tired before the first blow was struck, and heaven help you if you realised, after all of this, that you'd forgotten something. Your sword, your shield, your lucky charm, because going back for it meant either fighting without it or starting the entire armouring process over again. So you stood there, encased in metal, sweating, uncomfortable, possibly wet, waiting for someone to try to kill you. And you thought to yourself, there has to be a better way to make a living. There wasn't. Your warhorse wasn't just a ride. It was an investment, a weapon, and quite possibly the most expensive thing you'd ever own. A good destrier, a medieval warhorse bred specifically for combat, could cost as much as an entire village. Lose your horse in battle and you weren't just stranded, you were financially ruined. And these weren't gentle, obedient animals. Warhorses were aggressive, highly trained, and temperamental. They'd kick enemies, bite other horses, and if you didn't treat them right, they'd absolutely throw you off mid-charge and leave you to get trampled by your own side. Let's start with the economics, because they were staggering. A destrier in the 13th or 14th century could cost anywhere from 50 to 300 times the annual wage of a skilled craftsman. To put that in modern terms, imagine spending somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million on a single animal, an animal that could die from disease, injury, or an arrow to the chest at any moment. There was no insurance policy, no warranty. If your horse dropped dead, you were financially devastated and militarily useless. This is why many knights owned multiple horses. Not because they were wealthy, but because they couldn't afford not to. You'd have your destrier for actual combat, a courser for travel and scouting, a palfrey for casual riding, and a pack horse for carrying your equipment. Each one cost money to buy and more money to maintain. Horses needed food, a lot of it. A warhorse could eat through 20 to 30 pounds of grain and hay per day. In winter, when fresh grass wasn't available, those costs skyrocketed. You also needed a groom to care for them, a farrier to shoe them, and a stable to house them. Owning horses was like having 4 very expensive, very needy roommates who couldn't contribute to rent. But the destrier was special. This wasn't a farm horse or a riding pony. Destriers were bred for size, strength, and aggression. They stood 15 to 16 hands high, around 5 feet at the shoulder, and weighed upwards of 1,000 pounds. They were powerful enough to carry a fully armoured knight, fast enough to charge at terrifying speeds, and mean enough to be weapons in their own right. Training a warhorse took years. You couldn't just throw a saddle on any horse and ride it into battle. Horses are prey animals. Their natural instinct when confronted with danger is to run away. A warhorse has to be trained to run toward danger, to charge directly at screaming men with weapons, to tolerate the noise of battle, the clashing metal, the shouting, the smell of blood, and still obey commands. This required patience, repetition, and a trainer who knew what they were doing. The training process started when the horse was young. It would be desensitized to noise by having drums beaten near it, flags waved in its face and people shouting around it. It would be taught to respond to leg pressure and weight shifts because in battle, you couldn't always control your horse with reins. Your hands were busy holding weapons. The horse had to understand that pressure from your left leg meant turn right. Pressure from your right leg meant turn left. Both legs squeezing meant charge forward. Warhorses were also trained to fight. They'd kick out with their rear hooves, strike with their front hooves, bite enemies, and barrel into enemy formations like a 1,000-pound battering ram. A well-trained destrier could clear a path through foot soldiers, crushing them underfoot or sending them flying. There are accounts of horses biting off fingers, shattering jaws and breaking bones with kicks. They were as dangerous as the knight riding them. But here's the thing about training an animal to be aggressive and powerful. It doesn't turn off when you're not in battle. Your warhorse was temperamental on the best of days. They were high-strung, easily spooked, and quick to violence. Get too close to their rear end and you'd get kicked. Approach from the wrong angle and you'd get bitten. Fail to show dominance and they'd test you, rearing up, refusing to obey, or throwing you off just to prove they could. Bonding with your warhorse was essential, but it wasn't like bonding with a pet dog. This was a working relationship built on mutual respect and a healthy amount of fear on both sides. You respected the horse's power, and the horse respected your authority. Ideally. In reality, many knights struggled to control their horses. There are historical accounts of knights being thrown, trampled, or simply ignored by their own mounts during critical moments. The horse's equipment was almost as expensive as the horse itself. You needed a war saddle, which was built high at the front and back to keep you secure during combat. Medieval saddles had a tall cantle at the rear and a pommel at the front that essentially locked you in place. This was great for staying mounted when someone was trying to knock you off, but terrible if you actually needed to dismount quickly. Knights who fell while still partially attached to their saddles could be dragged by their own horses. Then there was the barding. Horse armour. Yes, horses wore armour too. Leather or metal plates to protect their heads, necks and chests. Full barding could weigh as much as 70 pounds, which meant your horse was carrying your weight, your armour, its own armour, and still had to run fast enough to be effective in a charge. This required an exceptionally strong animal and exceptional training. The cost of losing a warhorse in battle cannot be overstated. If your horse was killed under you, you were immediately at a massive disadvantage. A knight on foot was slower, less mobile, and extremely vulnerable. The weight of your armour, which was distributed while mounted, now rested entirely on your legs. You couldn't pursue fleeing enemies. You couldn't retreat quickly. You were stuck in the middle of a battlefield hoping someone would offer you a spare horse, or that the battle would end before you got killed. Financially, losing a horse meant you couldn't fulfill your military obligations. If your lord called you to war and you showed up on foot, you weren't a knight. You were just an expensive foot soldier. You'd have to borrow money, sell land, or beg for a loan to buy a new destrier. Many knights never recovered from this loss. They'd be forced to fight as common soldiers, their status as knights reduced to a technicality. There was also the emotional aspect. Knights spent years with their horses. They trained together, fought together, and depended on each other for survival. Many knights genuinely loved their horses, not in a sentimental way, but in the way you'd love a trusted partner who'd saved your life multiple times. Losing a horse in battle was traumatic, not just financially, but emotionally. Caring for a warhorse was a daily commitment. They needed to be fed at specific times, watered regularly, exercised to maintain fitness, and groomed to prevent skin problems and parasites. Their hooves needed constant attention. A thrown shoe or a cracked hoof could lame a horse for weeks, leaving you unable to fight. Your squire or groom would spend hours each day on horse maintenance, and even then, things could go wrong. Horses also got sick. Colic, respiratory infections, lameness, wounds from training or battle. Medieval veterinary medicine was primitive at best. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal poultices, and prayer. Many horses died from illnesses that would be easily treatable today, and when a warhorse died, you didn't just lose an animal, you lost years of training, a significant financial investment, and your ability to function as a knight. Some knights became so attached to their horses that they'd take reckless risks to protect them in battle, refusing to retreat because it would mean abandoning a wounded horse. Charging into dangerous situations to recover a horse that had bolted, spending money they didn't have on expensive treatments for sick horses. It was irrational, but understandable. The horse wasn't just property, it was a partner, and the horse knew it. Destriers were smart animals. They learned which knights were competent and which were nervous. They tested boundaries. Some horses developed reputations. This one was reliable, that one was vicious. This other one would throw anyone except its owner. Knights would trade stories about legendary warhorses the way modern soldiers talk about exceptional equipment. So yes, your warhorse was expensive, dangerous, temperamental, and essential. You'd spend more on it than almost anything else in your life. You'd trust it with your life in battle. And despite all the trouble, all the expense, and all the risk, you couldn't be a knight without one. Because a knight without a horse was just a very well-armed pedestrian, and nobody wrote songs about those. Sure, you had a sword. Every knight had a sword. It was part of the uniform, a symbol of status, a mark of being a warrior. But swords weren't actually your primary weapon. That honour went to the lance, a 10-foot wooden pole designed to impale your enemies while you charged at them on horseback. Lances were heavy, unwieldy, and required serious skill to use without accidentally stabbing your own horse or dropping the thing mid-charge. And if the lance broke, which it often did, you'd switch to a mace, an axe, or a warhammer, all of which required you to get uncomfortably close to someone else who was also trying to kill you. Let's start with the lance, because it was the defining weapon of mounted knights. These weren't light balanced spears. A proper jousting or war lance was anywhere from 10 to 14 feet long, made of solid wood, usually ash or oak, and weighed between 10 and 20 pounds. Holding one steady while riding a galloping horse required strength, balance, and practice. Lots of practice. The lance was held tucked under your arm, braced against your body, with the weight supported partly by your grip and partly by a small circular guard called a vamplate that protected your hand. The technique for using a lance effectively was called couched lance charging. You'd lower the lance, point it at your target, dig your spurs into your horse, and charge at full speed. The goal was to hit your opponent with the tip of the lance while the momentum of your charging horse did most of the work. If you hit correctly, the impact could punch through armour, unseat another knight, or impale an unarmoured foot soldier. The force generated by a charging warhorse and a properly aimed lance was devastating. But here's what made it difficult. You had to aim a 10-foot pole while bouncing around on a galloping animal, wearing a helmet that severely restricted your vision, and timing your strike for the split second when you and your target were in range. Miss by a few inches and the lance would glance off harmlessly. Hit at the wrong angle and the lance would shatter, sending splinters everywhere and leaving you weaponless. Drop the lance mid-charge, which happened more often than anyone wanted to admit, and you'd ride past your enemy looking like an idiot while they tried to kill you. Lances also broke, frequently. They were designed to break, actually. A lance that didn't break would transfer all the impact force back into your arm and shoulder, potentially dislocating your shoulder or breaking your arm. so lances were built with a deliberate weak point that would shatter on impact, dissipating the energy. This was great for your skeleton, but meant you needed multiple lances for any given battle or tournament. Knights would carry 2 or 3 lances, and their squires would carry more as backups. Once your lance was gone, you moved to close-quarters weapons, and this is where things got personal and violent. The sword, despite its iconic status, was actually a secondary weapon. Swords were effective against unarmoured or lightly armoured opponents, but against another knight in full plate armour, a sword was almost useless. You could slash at someone all day and barely dent their armour. Swords were expensive, difficult to make, and required significant training to use effectively. But they were also a status symbol. Carrying a sword marked you as nobility, as someone with the right to bear arms, so every knight had one, even if they rarely used it in actual combat. The real workhorses of knightly combat were blunt force weapons, maces, warhammers, and axes. These were designed specifically to deal with armoured opponents. A mace was essentially a metal club, a wooden or metal shaft with a heavy metal head, sometimes flanged, sometimes spiked. The weight of the head, combined with the leverage of the shaft, could generate enough force to dent armour, break bones underneath, and cause concussions even through a helmet. Maces didn't need to penetrate armour, they just needed to hit hard enough to turn your insides into jelly. Warhammers worked on the same principle but were more specialised. One side of the head was a blunt surface for crushing, the other side was a spike for puncturing. The spike could punch through armour gaps or even penetrate thinner plates. Warhammers were lighter than maces, which made them faster to swing but required more precision. You had to aim for weak points, joints, visors, the back of the neck, which was challenging when your target was moving and trying to kill you back. Axes came in various sizes. One-handed axes could be used from horseback or on foot and were good for hooking shields or armour straps. Two-handed axes, sometimes called poleaxes, were devastating weapons for dismounted combat. The combination of an axe blade, a hammerhead, and a top spike made them versatile. You could chop, crush, or stab depending on the situation. But they were heavy and slow. Swinging a poleaxe required commitment. If you missed, you'd be off balance and vulnerable. Each weapon required different skills and techniques. Sword fighting emphasized edge alignment, timing, and distance management. Mace fighting was about generating maximum force and landing crushing blows. Axe fighting required reading your opponent's movements and exploiting openings. You couldn't just pick up a weapon and be effective. You needed hundreds of hours of practice to build muscle memory, learn the weight and balance of each weapon, and develop the instincts necessary to fight effectively. Training with weapons started early in your career as a page and continued throughout your life. You'd practice against wooden posts called pels, striking them over and over until your technique was flawless. You'd spar with other squires and knights using blunted training weapons, though blunted was relative. Training weapons could still break bones. You'd learn to switch between weapons mid-fight, dropping a broken lance, drawing your sword, discarding it when it proved ineffective, and pulling out your mace without losing momentum. Weight was a constant factor. Your sword weighed 3 to 5 pounds. Your mace weighed 4 to 6 pounds. Your warhammer weighed 3 to 4 pounds. Your axe could weigh anywhere from 4 to 8 pounds. These don't sound heavy until you're swinging them repeatedly, while wearing 60 pounds of armour, riding a moving horse, or fighting on foot after you've already been in combat for 20 minutes and your arms feel like lead. Weapon maintenance was crucial and constant. Swords needed to be sharpened regularly. Maces and hammers needed to be checked for cracks in the shaft or loosening of the head. Axes needed their edges maintained and their handles replaced when they split. Rust was a constant enemy. You'd oil your weapons after every use, wrap them in oiled cloth when storing them, and inspect them before every battle. A weapon failure in combat was often fatal. There was also the dagger, the often overlooked backup weapon that saved more lives than people realise. Every knight carried at least one dagger, usually a rondel dagger or a misericord, a long, thin blade designed specifically for stabbing through armour gaps. If you ended up in a grappling match on the ground, the dagger was your best friend. You'd try to work the blade into joints, under the helmet, through the eye slit, anywhere the armour didn't cover. It was brutal, intimate, and effective. The The variety of weapons meant you needed to be proficient with all of them. You couldn't specialise. A knight who was great with a sword but incompetent with a mace was a liability. You had to train constantly, maintaining skills across multiple weapon types because you never knew what you'd need in battle. Your lance might break on the first charge. Your sword might get knocked from your hand. Your mace might get stuck in someone's armour. You needed backups, and you needed to know how to use them. There were also situational weapons, poleaxes for fighting on foot, flails, though less common than fiction suggests, for their unpredictable swing patterns, morning stars, which were maces with spiked heads. Each had advantages and disadvantages, and experienced knights would choose their weapons based on the expected combat conditions. Fighting in an open field, lance and sword, fighting in a confined space like a castle corridor, warhammer and dagger, fighting against heavily armoured opponents, mace or poleaxe. The psychological aspect of weapons shouldn't be underestimated either. Certain weapons were terrifying to face. A knight charging with a lance was frightening. A knight swinging a massive two-handed axe was nightmare fuel. Part of combat was intimidation, and the weapon you carried contributed to that. A well-maintained, impressive-looking weapon could make enemies hesitate, and in combat, hesitation was often fatal for them. Cost was another consideration. A good sword could cost as much as a small farm. A basic mace was cheaper, but still expensive. Weapons were investments, and losing one in battle meant replacing it, which meant spending money you probably didn't have. Knights who lost weapons would sometimes spend hours after battle searching the field for their gear, competing with looters and scavengers. The reality was that being a knight meant being comfortable with violence delivered in multiple ways. You needed to know how to kill from horseback and on foot, at range and up close, with blades and with blunt force. You trained until muscle memory took over, until you could switch weapons without thinking, until fighting became as natural as breathing. Because in the end, the weapon didn't matter as much as the person wielding it. A skilled knight with a basic mace was more dangerous than an amateur with an expensive sword, but you still wanted the expensive sword, just in case. Jousting wasn't just a fun medieval pastime. It was a full-contact, high-speed collision sport where two armoured men on horseback charged at each other with lances and tried to knock each other off. The goal was to shatter your lance against your opponent's shield or chest, ideally sending them flying backward in a dramatic spray of splinters. The reality was that you often missed, got hit in the face, broke bones, or occasionally died. Jousting deaths were common enough that the church tried to ban tournaments multiple times. Spoiler, nobody listened. Let's be clear about what jousting actually was. Controlled violence as entertainment. Two knights, fully armoured, would start at opposite ends of a list. A long, narrow field separated down the middle by a wooden barrier called the tilt. They'd lower their lances, spur their horses into a gallop, and charge directly at each other at combined speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. The goal was to strike your opponent's shield or body with enough force to either break your lance spectacularly, or better yet, knock them completely out of their saddle. The lances used in jousting were specifically designed for the sport. They were longer and lighter than war lances, usually around 12 to 14 feet, made from softer wood that would shatter on impact rather than punch through armour and kill someone. Though designed not to kill didn't mean safe. These lances could still cause serious damage. A well-placed hit could crack ribs through armour, cause concussions, or if the lance didn't break properly, impale you. The scoring system, when tournaments actually bothered with formal rules, awarded points for different types of hits. Breaking your lance on your opponent's shield was good. Breaking it on their helmet or body was better. Unhorsing your opponent, knocking them completely off their horse, was the ultimate achievement and usually won the match immediately. But judges were inconsistent. Rules varied by region, and half the time scoring came down to which knight looked more impressive while nearly dying. The run-up to a joust was its own kind of torture. You'd be sitting on your horse, fully armoured, lance in hand, waiting for the signal to charge. Your visibility was terrible through your helmet's visor. Your breathing was laboured. Your horse was prancing nervously, picking up on your tension. And across the field, another armoured figure was preparing to do the same thing you were. Try to hit you as hard as physically possible. When the signal came, usually a dropped flag or a trumpet blast, you'd dig your spurs into your horse and charge. The acceleration was immediate and violent. Your horse would go from standing to full gallop in seconds. You had to keep your lance steady, aim for your target and brace for impact, all while bouncing around in the saddle and trying to see through a narrow visor slit. The moment of impact lasted less than a second, but it was absolutely catastrophic. If you hit your opponent square, the force was tremendous. Even with armor designed to distribute the impact, you'd feel it through your entire body. Your shoulder would scream, your neck would snap back, your vision would blur, and if you were on the receiving end of a perfect hit, you'd feel yourself lifting out of the saddle, weightless for a horrible moment before crashing to the ground in 70 pounds of metal. Missing was almost as bad. If your lance glanced off or missed entirely, you'd ride past your opponent having accomplished nothing except looking incompetent in front of everyone watching. And everyone was watching. Tournaments were major social events. Nobles, ladies, common folk, they all came to see knights fight. Missing your opponent was publicly humiliating, and in a culture where honour and reputation were everything, humiliation could damage your career as much as a broken arm. Getting hit in the head was a special kind of nightmare. Despite helmets being designed to deflect lance strikes, direct hits to the helmet still happened. The impact could cause instant concussions, knock you unconscious, or in the worst cases cave in the helmet and crush your skull. There are documented cases of knights being killed when lance splinters entered through helmet visors and penetrated their brains. King Henry II of France died this way in 1559 when a splinter from his opponent's lance went through his visor and into his eye. He lingered for 10 days before dying from the wound. Even non-fatal head impacts were devastating. You'd see stars, lose your sense of balance, sometimes black out for a few seconds while still technically in the saddle. Knights would finish a joust, dismount, and only then realise they had no memory of the last few minutes. Repeated concussions were common among tournament knights, leading to long-term cognitive damage that medieval medicine had no way to address or even understand. Falling off your horse in full armour was dangerous for reasons beyond the obvious. The ground was hard, packed dirt or sand not exactly forgiving. You'd hit it at high speed, armour clanging, body bouncing. The impact could break bones, dislocate joints, or knock the wind out of you so completely you'd lie there gasping like a beached fish. And once you were down, getting up was nearly impossible without help. You'd be stuck on your back, flailing like an overturned beetle, while spectators laughed and your squire ran out to haul you upright. There was also the very real danger of being trampled. Horses didn't always stop cleanly after a pass. If you fell in front of a charging horse, yours or your opponent's, you could be stepped on, kicked, or run over. A horse's hoof coming down on your helmet or chest could cause fatal injuries, and there was nothing you could do to avoid it while lying helpless on the ground. The Church hated tournaments for good reason. Pope Innocent II banned them in 1130, declaring that knights killed in tournaments would be denied Christian burial. Pope Alexander III renewed the ban. Pope Innocent III banned them again. Nobody cared. Knights kept jousting, and when they died, their families just lied about the cause of death. He fell off his horse during training was a popular excuse that allowed for proper burial, while everyone quietly understood what had actually happened. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, jousting was wildly popular. For knights, tournaments were opportunities to win glory, attract patrons, earn prize money, and show off in front of potential wives or their current wives' friends. For spectators, it was thrilling entertainment. The combination of speed, violence, skill, and the very real possibility of watching someone die made tournaments the medieval equivalent of gladiatorial games. The prizes could be substantial. Winning a major tournament might earn you a horse, armour, weapons, or a large sum of money. Wealthy lords sometimes sponsored tournaments with extravagant prizes to attract the best knights. But entry fees were also expensive, and you had to factor in the cost of replacing broken equipment. Every shattered lance had to be replaced. Every dented piece of armour had to be repaired. If you lost badly, you might leave a tournament poorer than when you arrived. There was also the ransom system. In some tournaments, if you were unhorsed or defeated, you and your equipment became the property of your opponent until you paid a ransom. This could bankrupt knights who had bad days. Imagine losing 3 jousts in a row and having to ransom back your armour, weapons and horse 3 separate times. Some knights stopped competing not because they were injured, but because they literally couldn't afford to lose anymore. Training for jousting was its own form of suffering. You'd practice on the quintain, that rotating training device we mentioned earlier, until you could hit it consistently without getting smacked by the counterweight. You'd practice mounting and dismounting in full armour until you could do it quickly. You'd practice falling, learning how to tuck and roll to minimise injury, though rolling in plate armour was more like clanging heavily to one side. The psychological pressure was intense. Jousting in front of hundreds or thousands of people, knowing that one mistake could kill you or make you a laughingstock, took nerves of steel. Some knights thrived on it. Others vomited inside their helmets before matches. There was no shame in being nervous. You were about to be hit by a lance while travelling at high speed, but you couldn't show that fear publicly. Knights developed reputations based on their tournament performances. He who fights well in tournaments was a genuine compliment that could lead to better opportunities, marriage proposals and patronage. Conversely, he who keeps falling off his horse was a reputation that could ruin your career. Your performance in the list directly impacted your social standing and financial prospects. Some knights loved jousting so much they did it professionally, travelling from tournament to tournament, living on prize money and ransoms. William Marshall, one of medieval England's most famous knights, made his fortune on the tournament circuit before becoming a powerful noble. But for every William Marshall, there were dozens of knights who jousted once, got horrifically injured, and decided that maybe a quiet life managing a small estate wasn't so bad after all. The worst part, even if you survived jousting, the damage was cumulative. Repeated impacts, concussions, broken bones, and joint damage added up over the years. Old tournament knights were often crippled, arthritic, and mentally diminished from too many hits to the head. They'd shuffle around their estates, struggling to remember names, their bodies broken testaments, to a sport that valued glory over longevity. So yes, jousting was exciting, prestigious, and occasionally profitable. It was also statistically likely to injure or kill you, financially ruinous if you lost, and generally a terrible idea. But you did it anyway, because what else were you going to do? Not joust. Let everyone think you were a coward. Better to risk death than live with that kind of dishonour. Tournaments were supposed to be a way for knights to practice their skills, show off, and win glory. In reality, they were expensive, exhausting, and a great way to get yourself killed or maimed for no real reason. Entry fees were high, armour repairs were constant, and the prizes, usually not worth the broken ribs. But you went anyway, because if you didn't, people would think you were a coward. So you spent your limited money, risked your life, and prayed you didn't get trampled by some overexcited duke's son who thought he was invincible. Medieval tournaments weren't single events. They were multi-day festivals of violence that could include jousting, melee combat, archery competitions, and various other contests designed to separate knights from their money and occasionally their lives. The main event was usually the melee, a massive mock battle where dozens or even hundreds of knights would fight in teams, trying to capture opponents and claim ransoms. Early tournaments, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, were barely controlled chaos. There were few rules, no boundaries, and fights would spill out across the countryside for miles. Knights would chase each other through fields, forests, and villages, trampling crops and terrifying peasants. The goal was to capture as many enemy knights as possible, hold them for ransom, and collect their horses and equipment. It was less sporting event, and more sanctioned robbery with horses. The melee was especially brutal. Imagine 100 armoured men on horseback divided into 2 teams, charging at each other in an open field. No referees, no time limits, just pure, sustained violence until one side surrendered or ran out of fighters. You'd be swinging weapons, dodging blows, trying to unhorse opponents while avoiding being unhorsed yourself. The noise was deafening, metal clanging, horses screaming, men shouting. The dust was so thick you could barely see. And somewhere in that chaos, you were supposed to distinguish friend from foe and fight accordingly. Friendly fire was common. In the confusion of battle, with limited visibility through your helmet and everyone wearing similar armour, you'd sometimes hit your own teammates. This led to arguments, feuds, and occasionally real fights breaking out within the same team. There are accounts of tournament melees turning into genuine brawls when someone got hit one too many times by their supposed allies. The ransom system turned tournaments into financial battlegrounds. If you captured an opponent, you could demand payment for their release and keep their equipment until they paid. This created a perverse incentive to target wealthy knights who could afford large ransoms while ignoring poorer knights who weren't worth the effort. Some tournament veterans became experts at identifying valuable targets and would spend the entire melee hunting specific opponents like predators stalking prey. For wealthy knights, tournaments were manageable expenses. They could afford to lose a few ransoms, replace damaged equipment, and keep competing. For everyone else, tournaments were financial gambles. You'd pay the entry fee, spend money on travel and lodging, risk your expensive equipment, and hope you'd win enough to break even. Most didn't. Most went home poorer, injured, and vowing never to do it again until the next tournament was announced. The entry fees themselves were significant. Lords hosting tournaments charged knights for the privilege of competing, using the fees to offset the costs of organising the event. If you couldn't pay, you couldn't compete, and if you couldn't compete, you'd lose status among your peers. It was a system designed to keep poor knights poor and desperate. Equipment damage was constant and expensive. Every tournament meant dented armour that needed hammering out, broken straps that needed replacing, weapons that needed sharpening or repair. Lances shattered by the dozen, shields splintered, helmets got crushed, and all of it had to be fixed before the next event, which meant paying armourers, weaponsmiths, and leather workers. The costs added up quickly. Injuries were inevitable. Even in friendly tournaments, men got hurt. Broken bones, dislocated shoulders, crushed fingers, concussions. These were standard outcomes. You'd see knights hobbling around after melees, arms in slings, faces bruised, limping from twisted ankles or worse. Some injuries were career-ending. A shattered knee could leave you unable to ride. A severe head injury could leave you mentally impaired. But you couldn't stop competing without losing your reputation. The social pressure to participate was immense. Tournaments were where knights proved themselves, made connections, and attracted patronage. A knight who never attended tournaments was viewed with suspicion. Was he cowardly, incompetent, too poor to afford equipment? The assumptions were never flattering. So even if you hated tournaments, even if you'd been injured at the last three, you showed up to the next one and put on a brave face. The spectacle aspect made everything worse. Tournaments weren't private affairs. They were public events attended by nobles, ladies, clergy, merchants, and commoners. Everyone watched. Everyone judged. If you performed well, your reputation soared. If you got humiliated, thrown from your horse, captured immediately, knocked unconscious in the first minute, everyone saw it, and they'd remember it. Medieval society loved gossip, and tournament failures became stories told and retold. For unmarried knights, tournaments were also marriage markets. Young noblewomen attended to watch knights compete, and families arranged marriages based partly on tournament performance. A knight who distinguished himself might catch the eye of a wealthy heiress's father. A knight who got repeatedly demolished probably wasn't getting any marriage proposals. This added another layer of pressure. You weren't just fighting for glory, you were fighting for your romantic and financial future. The prizes, when they existed, were often disappointing. Sure, major tournaments sponsored by kings or wealthy lords might offer substantial rewards. Horses, armour, large sums of money. But most tournaments offered modest prizes that didn't come close to covering your expenses. You might win a decent horse after spending 3 times its value on entry fees, equipment repairs, and medical treatment for your broken arm. Some tournaments also featured bizarre additional competitions: sword fighting on foot, wrestling matches, archery contests, stone throwing. These side events had their own entry fees and their own risks. Knights who were desperate for any prize money would enter everything, spreading themselves too thin and increasing their chances of injury. The lodging situation around tournaments was a nightmare. Thousands of knights, squires, servants, and spectators would descend on whatever town was hosting. Inns would fill immediately, price gouging shamelessly. If you arrived late, you'd be sleeping in a tent, a barn, or just on the ground. Your horse needed shelter and food too, and stables charged premium rates during tournaments. Everything cost more than it should, and everyone knew you had no choice but to pay. Food vendors at tournaments were equally opportunistic. A simple meal that would cost pennies normally would cost several times that during a tournament. Water was overpriced, beer was watered down, and if you wanted anything approaching quality food, you'd pay even more. Many nights survived tournament weekends on bread, cheese, and the bitterness of financial regret. The political dimension of tournaments added another complication. Tournaments were opportunities for lords to display power, for regional rivalries to play out, and for old grudges to resurface under the guise of friendly competition. Knights sometimes fought harder against opponents from rival territories, turning tournaments into proxy wars. This could lead to genuine violence, riots, and diplomatic incidents. There were also rigged tournaments. Wealthy lords would sometimes stack teams with professional fighters, ensuring their side won. They'd bribe judges, manipulate rules, or simply use their political power to guarantee favourable outcomes. If you were a minor knight competing against a team sponsored by a powerful duke, you were probably going to lose regardless of skill. Despite all this, the expense, the danger, the corruption, the questionable prizes, knights kept attending tournaments. Why? Because the alternative was worse. Not competing meant social death. It meant being overlooked for positions, ignored by potential patrons, and dismissed by your peers. The tournament circuit was where reputations were made and careers were built. You couldn't afford not to go. Some knights became professional tournament competitors, travelling from event to event, living on prize money and ransom payments. This was a precarious existence. One bad injury could end your career. One stretch of losses could bankrupt you. But for knights with no land, no inheritance, and no other prospects, the tournament circuit was their only path to wealth and status. The Church's opposition to tournaments never really worked. Popes would issue bans, threaten excommunication, and refuse Christian burial to knights killed in tournaments. Knights would nod politely, and then go joust anyway. The cultural importance of tournaments was too great, and the Church's threats were empty. Everyone knew that dead tournament knights would be quietly buried with full rites, the official cause of death creatively reinterpreted. By the late medieval period, tournaments had become more regulated and slightly less deadly. Rules were established, boundaries were set, blunted weapons became more common, but they were still dangerous, still expensive, and still mostly pointless from a practical standpoint. The skills practiced in tournaments had limited battlefield application. Real wars weren't fought in neat lists with clear rules and helpful barriers, but practicality wasn't the point. Tournaments were about display, about masculinity, about proving you were brave enough to risk death for glory. They were about maintaining a system that kept knights relevant in a changing world, and they were about separating desperate men from their money while giving them just enough hope to keep coming back. So you'd pack your equipment, drain your savings, kiss your wife goodbye, and ride off to the next tournament. You'd compete, get injured, lose money, and swear you'd never do it again. And then 6 months later, when the next tournament was announced, you'd start preparing all over again. Because that's what knights did. They showed up, got beaten, paid for the privilege, and called it honour. You'd think that after years of training, battle would be where knights finally shined. But medieval battles were chaotic, brutal, and terrifying. There was no clean choreography, no noble duels, no heroic speeches. Just mud, screaming, horses panicking, and someone trying to stab you in the armpit. The one gap in your armour you couldn't quite protect. Visibility was terrible inside your helmet. Communication was impossible over the noise, and if you fell off your horse, you were done. A knight on the ground in full armour was about as mobile as an overturned turtle, and just as vulnerable. The reality of medieval battle began long before the actual fighting. You'd march for days or weeks to reach the battlefield, sleeping in muddy camps, eating whatever rations hadn't spoiled, and dealing with the constant low-grade fear that came from knowing you were walking toward people who wanted to kill you. By the time you arrived, you were already exhausted, hungry, and psychologically worn down. The morning of battle was a special kind of torture. You'd wake before dawn, stomach churning with anxiety. Breakfast, if you could stomach it, was probably stale bread and weak ale. Then came the arming process. 20 minutes of your squire strapping you into your metal prison while your hands shook, and your bladder insisted once again that now would be a great time to empty itself. Once armoured, you'd mount your horse and join your unit. Knights fought in formations, usually grouped by lord or region. You'd take your position in the line, surrounded by other armoured men on horses, and wait. Medieval battles involved a lot of waiting. Commanders would negotiate, position troops, give speeches you couldn't hear from the back, and generally delay the inevitable while everyone's nerves frayed further. The tension before a charge was unbearable. Your horse could feel your anxiety and would prance nervously, tossing its head and snorting. Your lance felt impossibly heavy. Your armour felt impossibly tight. And across the field you could see the enemy. Another wall of armoured men on horses, or worse, a forest of pikes held by determined foot soldiers who'd been specifically trained to kill cavalry. When the order finally came to charge, everything happened too fast and too slow simultaneously. You'd spur your horse forward, and suddenly you were galloping toward the enemy, the ground shaking under thousands of hooves. The noise overwhelming, shouting, horses screaming, armour clanging. Your vision narrowed to a small tunnel through your visor. You couldn't see your friends on either side. You couldn't see the ground. You could only see what was directly in front of you, and it was getting closer very, very fast. The impact of a cavalry charge was catastrophic for everyone involved. If you hit an enemy line successfully, the collision was violent and disorienting. Bodies flew, horses stumbled, men screamed. Your lance would either shatter against armour, punch into flesh, or get torn from your hands. Then you were in the middle of enemy forces, swinging whatever weapon came next, trying to stay in your saddle while people jabbed at you from all directions. If the enemy had prepared properly, pikes, stakes, or disciplined infantry, your charge might fail completely. Horses weren't stupid. They wouldn't run into a wall of sharp objects. They'd slow down, try to turn or rear up, throwing you off. There are accounts of cavalry charges breaking apart before they even reached the enemy, knights scattered across the field as their horses refused to cooperate. Once you were in the melee, all your training dissolved into pure chaos. You couldn't execute perfect techniques. You just swung your weapon as hard as you could at anything that looked like an enemy, hoping you were hitting the right people. The noise was deafening. Metal on metal, horses shrieking, men shouting and dying. You couldn't hear orders. You couldn't coordinate with your allies. You were alone in a crowd of violence. Visibility was your enemy. Inside a closed helmet, you could barely see. The visor slit was narrow, your peripheral vision was gone, and if your helmet got knocked sideways, which happened constantly, you might be completely blind. Knights would tear their helmets off mid-battle just to see, immediately becoming vulnerable to head strikes. It was a terrible choice. Die blind or die unprotected. The mud was another nightmare. Medieval battlefields weren't pristine fields. They were churned up masses of mud, blood and filth. Horses would slip and fall. Men would lose their footing. If you went down, the mud would suck at your armour, making it nearly impossible to stand. You'd be stuck there, flailing, while enemy soldiers closed in to finish you off or drag you away for ransom if you were lucky. Getting unhorsed was the worst-case scenario. One moment you were fighting from a position of relative power, the next you were on your back in the mud with 70 pounds of armour pinning you down. Standing up in full plate armour required leverage, strength and time, all things you didn't have in the middle of a battle. You'd roll onto your stomach, push yourself to your hands and knees, and try to lever yourself upright while people stepped over you, kicked you, or tried to kill you. If you couldn't get up, you were captured or killed. Enemy soldiers would swarm fallen knights, checking for marks of nobility that indicated ransom potential. Rich knights were taken prisoner. Poor knights were often just killed where they lay, stabbed through armour gaps with daggers. It was efficient, brutal, and extremely common. The armour gaps were critical vulnerabilities. Armpits, the back of the knees, the groin, the neck. Anywhere plates met and couldn't overlap completely. Experienced fighters knew these weak points and aimed for them. You'd be grappling with someone, both of you trying to work a dagger into the other's joints while shoving, pulling and struggling in the mud. It wasn't noble. It was desperate and ugly. Exhaustion set in quickly. Fighting in armour was like doing high-intensity cardio while wearing a weighted vest in a sauna. Within minutes, you'd be gasping for air, your arms burning, your legs trembling. But you couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying. So you pushed through, running on adrenaline and terror, until either the battle ended or your body gave out. The confusion was total. You rarely knew how the battle was going. You couldn't see the whole field. You didn't know if your side was winning or losing, you just knew that people were trying to kill you and you were trying to kill them back. Sometimes you'd fight for hours without any idea whether retreat had been called or reinforcements had arrived. Friendly fire was a constant danger. In the chaos with limited visibility and everyone covered in mud and blood, it was hard to tell a friend from foe. Knights would accidentally hit their allies, creating confusion and anger that sometimes erupted into fights within the same army. There are accounts of battles being lost because friendly units started fighting each other in the confusion. The sounds of battle stayed with you, the specific noise of a sword hitting a helmet, the wet crunch of a mace crushing bone, the screaming, not battle cries, but genuine screams of pain and terror. Men calling for their mothers, men begging for mercy, men making sounds that didn't seem human. You'd hear these sounds in your sleep for the rest of your life, assuming you survived. Horses died by the hundreds. They'd be cut down by pikes, trip over bodies, collapse from exhaustion, or panic and throw their riders before bolting. A dead or dying horse was a massive obstacle. You couldn't just step over it in armour. You had to go around, which meant changing direction in the middle of combat, exposing yourself to attacks from new angles. The smell was overpowering. Blood, obviously, but also shit. Fear and injury both caused bowels to release. Horses voided themselves. Men pissed and defecated inside their armour from terror or from being unable to leave formation. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the acrid smell of fear and waste created an unforgettable stench that clung to your armour and clothes for days. Injuries were common and often disabling. Even if you didn't die, you'd likely leave the battle with broken bones, deep bruises, concussions, or worse. Knights would fight through injuries that would hospitalise people today. Broken fingers, cracked ribs, dislocated shoulders. You just kept fighting because the alternative was dying. The adrenaline would mask the pain until later, when you'd try to remove your armour and discover you couldn't move your arm. The end of a battle was almost as dangerous as the fighting itself. If your side won, you'd have to pursue fleeing enemies while exhausted and injured, risking ambushes or your horse stepping in a hole and breaking its leg. If your side lost, you'd have to retreat in good order, which was nearly impossible when everyone was panicking. Retreating knights would be cut down by pursuing enemies, captured for ransom, or trampled by their own fleeing forces. After the battle ended, assuming you survived, you'd be utterly spent. Too tired to dismount, too disoriented to process what had happened. Covered in blood, yours, your horse's, other people's, you couldn't tell. Your armour was dented, your weapons damaged or lost, and you'd have to spend the next several hours searching the battlefield for your equipment among the dead and dying. And the worst part? You'd have to do it all again. Medieval warfare wasn't one battle. It was campaign after campaign, siege after siege, skirmish after skirmish. Each one was a fresh opportunity to die, be maimed or be captured. The more battles you survived, the more your luck seemed to wear thin. So no, battle wasn't where knights shined. It was where they survived, barely, and then spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd seen and done in the mud and chaos. Welcome to medieval warfare. Your training prepared you for maybe 10% of it. Ah yes, chivalry. The code of honour that knights were supposed to follow. Protect the weak, defend the innocent, show mercy to your enemies, be courteous to ladies. Sounds noble, right? Except in practice, most knights ignored it completely. Chivalry was a nice idea written down by poets and priests, but on the battlefield, knights were pragmatic. They killed, looted, and took prisoners for ransom just like everyone else. The code was more of a suggestion, and only the really wealthy knights could afford to follow it. The concept of chivalry emerged in the 12th century, as the church tried to civilize an entire class of professional warriors who spent most of their time killing people and taking their stuff. The word itself comes from the French chevalier, meaning horseman, and the code was essentially a list of aspirational behaviours that knights were supposed to embody. Be brave, be loyal, be generous, be courteous, protect women and the weak, fight for the church, honour your oaths. It was beautiful in theory. In practice, it was ignored more often than a modern terms of service agreement. Most knights had never actually read the chivalric codes. They were illiterate. The codes existed in manuscripts owned by monasteries and wealthy nobles, written in Latin or French. inaccessible to the average knight who just wanted to know which end of the sword to hold. What knights knew about chivalry came from songs, stories, and whatever their lord told them, which was usually a heavily edited version that emphasised loyalty and obedience while conveniently skipping the parts about mercy and compassion. The reality was that chivalry had a class problem baked into it from the start. The code explicitly applied only to interactions between nobles. You were supposed to show mercy to a captured knight, because he was worth ransom money and because he was your social equal. But peasants? Commoners? Enemy foot soldiers? The code had nothing to say about them, which in practice meant you could do whatever you wanted, and what knights usually wanted was to loot villages, steal supplies, and kill anyone who resisted. Take the principle of protecting the weak. This sounds lovely until you realise that medieval knights defined the weak very narrowly as noblewomen of our own religion and nationality. Everyone else was fair game. Knights routinely terrorised peasant populations during campaigns. They'd raid farms, steal livestock, burn crops and assault villagers. All standard military practice that no one considered a violation of chivalry. The treatment of women under chivalry was particularly hypocritical. Yes, knights were supposed to be courteous to ladies, honour them, defend them. But this applied only to noble women, and even then, only sometimes. Peasant women had no protections. They could be assaulted, robbed or killed with impunity. And even noble women weren't safe if they were on the wrong side of a conflict. Castles full of women were besieged and starved. Cities were sacked with no regard for gender. The romantic ideal of chivalry, knights performing deeds of valour to win a lady's favour, was mostly literary fantasy. Real knights married for land and political alliances, not love. The whole courtly love tradition, where knights pined after unattainable married noblewomen and performed heroic acts in their honour, was a game played by bored aristocrats with too much time on their hands. It had nothing to do with how actual marriages worked, or how women were actually treated. Mercy on the battlefield was entirely economic. If an enemy knight was wealthy enough to pay ransom, you captured him alive, treated him relatively well and negotiated a price with his family. This wasn't mercy, it was business. If that same knight was poor, or if you were in a hurry, or if your lord had ordered no prisoners, you'd kill him without a second thought. The chivalric ideal of sparing defeated enemies only applied when it was profitable. The concept of a fair fight was similarly flexible. Chivalry supposedly required knights to face each other honourably in single combat. In reality, knights used every tactical advantage available. Ambushes were common. Surprise attacks were standard. If you could win by outnumbering your enemy, by attacking from behind, or by using terrain to your advantage, you did it. Honour was for poets. Survival was for warriors. Religious warfare made a mockery of chivalry. During the Crusades, knights who were supposed to embody Christian virtue committed atrocities that would shock modern readers. Massacres of civilian populations. Mass executions of prisoners, systematic looting and destruction, all justified as holy war, all committed by knights who probably attended Mass that morning. The code of chivalry apparently didn't apply to Muslims, Jews or Orthodox Christians, which was convenient for knights who wanted to claim piety while engaging in wholesale slaughter. Even among Christians fighting other Christians, chivalry was selectively applied. Civil wars and internal conflicts were often more brutal than foreign wars because the stakes were higher and the hatreds more personal. Knights fighting for rival claimants to a throne didn't exchange courteous greetings before battle. They killed each other efficiently and looted the bodies afterward. The generosity principle, that knights should be generous with their wealth, was laughable. Most knights were broke. They couldn't afford to be generous, and the wealthy knights who could afford it were often the stingiest, having accumulated their wealth precisely by not giving it away. Yes, there were feasts and displays of largesse, but these were strategic investments in reputation, not genuine generosity. Loyalty was the one principle of chivalry that knights actually followed, mostly because betraying your lord was an excellent way to get executed. But even loyalty had limits. Knights switched sides when it was politically advantageous. They rebelled when their lords couldn't pay them or protect them, and in civil wars, choosing which side to be loyal to was often a matter of calculating which lord was more likely to win and reward your service. The Church tried desperately to enforce chivalric behaviour through spiritual threats. Breaking your oaths would damn your soul. Fighting on holy days would bring divine punishment. Killing defenseless people would send you to hell. Knights nodded solemnly and then did whatever their military situation required. They'd confess their sins afterward, do penance, and absolve themselves. Rinse and repeat for the next campaign. Some knights did genuinely try to live by chivalric principles, and they were considered eccentric at best, dangerously naive at worst. A knight who insisted on fighting fairly, showing mercy, and protecting the innocent wouldn't last long in medieval warfare. He'd be outmaneuvered by pragmatic opponents, exploited by ruthless enemies, and probably die young, leaving his family impoverished. Chivalry was a luxury for the successful, not a path to success. The literature of the time told stories of perfect knights, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, who embodied chivalric virtues completely. These stories were popular precisely because they were fantasies. Everyone knew real knights weren't like this. The stories were aspirational, not documentary. They showed what knights wished they could be, not what they actually were. Tournaments at least allowed knights to practice a form of chivalry, with rules, referees, and consequences for breaking protocol. But as we've discussed, even tournaments were rife with cheating, bending of rules, and pragmatic fighting that had little to do with honour. The most successful tournament knights were often the most ruthlessly efficient, not the most chivalrous. The gap between chivalric ideal and reality was so obvious that it became a joke even in medieval times. Satirical works mocked knights who claimed to follow chivalry while behaving like bandits. Peasants told stories about hypocritical knights who preached virtue and practiced vice. Everyone knew the code was mostly performative. What's interesting is how persistent the myth became despite everyone knowing it was a myth. Knights kept swearing chivalric oaths they had no intention of keeping. Nobles kept commissioning poems about perfect knights who didn't exist. And society kept pretending that the warrior class was bound by a code of honour, even while that same warrior class was burning down villages and holding people for ransom. Part of this was social necessity. The feudal system required everyone to believe that nobles and knights were fundamentally different from common people, better, nobler, more honourable. Chivalry provided the ideological justification for a military aristocracy. If knights were just violent men on horses, why should they have special privileges? But if they were honourable warriors bound by a sacred code, well, that justified their position in society. The code of chivalry did serve one practical purpose. It created a shared culture among the nobility across Europe. A French knight and an English knight might be enemies, but they both understood the same chivalric references, valued similar virtues, at least in theory, and could interact according to established protocols. This made diplomacy, ransoms, and truces possible. It was a shared language of the elite, even if nobody actually spoke it fluently. For modern people looking back, the myth of chivalry has proven remarkably durable. We still use chivalrous as a compliment. We still imagine knights as honourable heroes. The fantasy persists because we want to believe that warriors can be noble, that violence can be civilised, that might can be coupled with right. Medieval knights knew better. They understood that chivalry was a beautiful lie they told themselves and others, a lie that made their brutal profession seem almost admirable. So the next time you hear about the age of chivalry, remember, it was an age of codes that were written but not followed, principles that were praised but not practiced, and ideals that existed mainly in poetry, while reality remained bloody, pragmatic, and utterly unchivalrous. The code of chivalry wasn't a guide for knight behaviour, it was marketing. And medieval knights were excellent at marketing themselves as something far better than what they actually were. If you were lucky enough to own or serve in a castle, congratulations! You now lived in a giant stone refrigerator. Castles were built for defence, not comfort. The walls were thick, which kept out enemies but also kept out warmth. There was no central heating, just fireplaces that barely worked and filled rooms with smoke. Your bed was hard, your food was cold, and if the castle was under siege, you'd be trapped inside for weeks or months, slowly running out of supplies while eating progressively worse meals and wondering if you'd ever see sunlight again. Let's start with the basic architecture. Castle walls were typically 6 to 20 feet thick, made of stone and rubble. This was excellent for stopping battering rams, catapult stones and arrows. It was terrible for insulation. Stone is thermally conductive, meaning it absorbs cold from outside and radiates it inward. In winter, castle walls would be ice cold to the touch. In summer, they'd retain heat like an oven. There was no winning. Windows were small and few, because large windows were structural weaknesses that enemies could exploit. The windows that did exist were narrow slits designed for archers to shoot through, not for letting in light or air. Some wealthier castles had glazed windows, but glass was expensive and the panes were small. Most windows were just openings covered with wooden shutters, which you could close to keep out wind and rain, thereby also eliminating all light and air circulation. Your choice: freeze in the dark or freeze in a windstorm. The Great Hall. The central room where everyone gathered to eat and socialise was usually the largest space in the castle, and therefore the hardest to heat. A massive fireplace at one end would burn constantly, consuming enormous amounts of wood and producing a radius of warmth that extended maybe 10 feet. If you were sitting near the fire, you'd roast on one side and freeze on the other. If you were anywhere else in the hall, you might as well have been outside. Smoke was a constant problem. Medieval fireplaces didn't have proper chimneys at first, just holes in the ceiling that let smoke drift upward and out. This meant the hall was perpetually hazy with smoke that burned your eyes, coated everything in soot, and probably took years off everyone's lives through slow lung damage. Later castles had actual chimneys, which helped, but not enough. You still spent your days breathing smoke and smelling like a campfire. Bedrooms, or more accurately sleeping chambers, were small, dark, and miserably cold. The bed itself was often a wooden frame with rope supports and a mattress stuffed with straw. Feathers if you were wealthy. Heavy curtains around the bed helped trap body heat and provide a small amount of privacy. But they also trapped the smell of whoever was sleeping there, which, given the general lack of bathing, was considerable. You'd climb into bed wearing most of your clothes, pile on furs and wool blankets, and still wake up with numb extremities. The floors were stone, sometimes covered with rushes, dried grasses or reeds scattered to provide some insulation and absorb dirt. These rushes were supposed to be changed regularly, but often weren't. They'd get compacted, mouldy, and filled with food scraps, animal droppings, and various other delightful debris. Walking across castle floors meant crunching through a biological carpet of questionable composition. Sanitation in castles was primitive. The garderobe, the medieval toilet, was typically a small closet with a hole in the floor that dropped waste directly down the exterior wall into the moat or a cesspit below. Sitting there in winter with cold air rushing up through the hole and the wind howling outside was a uniquely miserable experience. There was no toilet paper, just old rags or moss, and the smell permeated the entire tower, permanently marking garderobe towers as the least desirable places to have chambers. Privacy was essentially non-existent. Castles weren't divided into individual rooms like modern houses. They had large halls and chambers where multiple people slept, worked, and lived together. Knights, servants, family members, everyone sharing space. Important nobles might have a private chamber, but even then their servants slept in the same room or just outside the door. You were never truly alone. Daily life in a castle was communal and hierarchical. Everyone ate together in the great hall, with seating arranged by rank. The lord and his family sat at the high table on a raised platform. Knights and important guests sat at tables below. Servants stood or sat on benches along the walls. The food quality decreased as you moved away from the high table. The lord got roasted meats and spiced wine. The servants got pottage and weak ale. Meals were elaborate social performances, multiple courses, specific etiquette rules, entertainment from musicians or jesters. But the food itself, despite the ceremony, was often cold by the time it reached you. Kitchens were separate buildings to prevent fires from spreading, which meant food had to be carried across courtyards to reach the dining hall. In winter, everything arrived lukewarm at best, congealed at worst. The routine was monotonous. Wake before dawn, attend morning prayers in the chapel, break your fast with bread and ale, attend to whatever duties your position required, training, administrative work, overseeing servants, eat dinner in late morning, more work, supper in the evening, prayers again, sleep, repeat, day after day, month after month, year after year. The castle walls that protected you also imprisoned you in a cycle of sameness. Entertainment options were limited. If you could read, you might have access to a few books, though most castles had small libraries, if any. Music, storytelling, dice games, chess, these passed the time. In good weather you could hunt or hawk. But in winter, during sieges, or when illness kept you indoors, you were stuck with the same small group of people in the same cold rooms doing the same things until you wanted to scream from boredom. And then there were the sieges. Castles were built to withstand attack, which meant they were designed to be sealed up and defended for extended periods. When an enemy army surrounded your castle, everyone inside, knights, soldiers, servants, animals, would be trapped together, sometimes for months. This was where castle life went from merely uncomfortable to genuinely nightmarish. During a siege, supplies dwindled rapidly. Fresh food ran out first. Then preserved foods. Then whatever could be stretched, rationed, or creatively repurposed. Water could run out if the castle's well was inadequate or poisoned. People would be put on strict rations, eating progressively smaller portions of progressively worse food. Morale would crater as hunger set in, and the situation looked increasingly hopeless. Disease spread quickly in besieged castles. Hundreds of people crammed into close quarters, sanitation systems overwhelmed, food quality declining, stress levels through the roof, perfect conditions for illness. Dysentery, typhus, and other diseases would sweep through the population. The dead would have to be buried within the castle grounds or in desperate situations thrown over the walls, creating both a sanitation hazard and a psychological horror. The psychological toll of siege life was immense. You couldn't leave. You couldn't know how long it would last. You'd watch supplies dwindling, knowing that eventual starvation was a real possibility. The enemy outside would sometimes taunt defenders, execute prisoners in view of the walls, or use psychological warfare to break morale. Inside, tensions would rise. Arguments would break out. Some defenders might advocate for surrender while others insisted on holding out. Castle defenders also had to deal with enemy siege weapons. Catapults and trebuchets would hurl stones at the walls day and night, the impacts shaking the entire structure. Sometimes they'd throw other things, diseased animal corpses to spread plague, pots of burning pitch to start fires, even captured prisoners to demoralize defenders. You'd live in constant fear that the next projectile would bring down the wall or crash through the roof of your chamber. Undermining was another terrifying siege tactic. Enemy forces would dig tunnels beneath the castle walls, prop them up with wooden supports, then set fire to the supports. The tunnel would collapse, taking a section of wall with it. Defenders would try to detect undermining by placing bowls of water on the ground and watching for ripples that indicated digging. If they found a tunnel, they'd dig their own counter-tunnel and fight the enemy underground in claustrophobic darkness. Even in peacetime, castle maintenance was endless and expensive. Stone needed to be repaired, roofs needed to be patched, gates and portcullises needed their mechanisms maintained. Moats needed to be cleaned, a disgusting job given what accumulated in them. Wells needed to be checked for contamination. All of this required skilled workers, materials and money that most castle owners barely had. The cost of maintaining a garrison was also substantial. You needed soldiers, and soldiers needed to be paid, fed and equipped. You needed armourers, blacksmiths, cooks, servants, stable hands, and various other specialists. All of these people required wages, food, and lodging. A medium-sized castle might have a permanent population of 50 to 100 people, all consuming resources daily. Castles were also political statements that made you a target. Building a castle announced that you had wealth, power, and something worth defending. This attracted attention from rivals, bandits, and ambitious lords looking to expand their territory. Owning a castle meant constantly preparing for the next attack, the next siege, the next test of your defences. For all their defensive strength, castles were eventually rendered obsolete by gunpowder. Cannons could batter down walls that had withstood armies for centuries. The thick stone walls that made castles impregnable became liabilities when they could be demolished by artillery. By the late medieval period, castles were transitioning from military fortifications to residential palaces, their defensive features becoming decorative rather than functional. But in their heyday, castles were the ultimate symbol of medieval power and the ultimate expression of medieval discomfort. You lived in a cold, draughty, smoky, smelly stone box that could become your tomb if an enemy decided to park an army outside your gates. You sacrificed comfort for security and still weren't entirely secure. So yes, living in a castle made you important. It gave you status, defensive capability, and a symbol of your authority. It also gave you cold feet, smoky lungs, and a persistent fear that someday soon you'd be eating your last horse while enemy soldiers dug tunnels underneath your bedroom. Welcome to castle life. At least the walls were thick. Sieges were less about glorious combat and more about waiting. You'd surround a castle, cut off supplies, and wait for the people inside to starve or surrender. This could take months. During that time, you sat outside in a muddy camp, ate terrible food, got sick, and occasionally got shot at by archers on the walls. If you were inside the castle, you had it worse. You were trapped, hungry, and running out of water while the enemy outside built siege engines designed to knock down your walls or fling diseased animals over them. If you were part of the besieging force, your life became an endless cycle of tedium punctuated by moments of terror. The first few days were almost exciting, setting up camp, positioning forces, maybe launching a few probing attacks to test the defences. But once the castle was fully surrounded and the defenders settled in for a long resistance, reality set in. You were going to be here for a while, possibly a very long while. The siege camp itself was miserable. Imagine a temporary city of tents, wagons, and hastily constructed shelters sprawled across muddy fields. Thousands of soldiers, horses, camp followers, and support staff all crammed together with minimal sanitation and organisation. The smell alone was staggering. Unwashed bodies, horse manure, cooking fires, latrines that were just trenches dug at the edge of camp. Everything smelled like smoke, sweat, and waste. Your tent, if you had one, was a basic canvas structure that kept out some rain, but none of the cold. You shared it with several other knights or soldiers, sleeping on the ground with whatever bedding you'd brought. Privacy was impossible. The constant noise, talking, snoring, arguments, animals, meant sleep was fitful at best. And if it rained, which it often did, the tent would leak and the ground would turn to mud, soaking everything you owned. Food during sieges was a nightmare. The besieging army had to feed itself while simultaneously preventing food from reaching the defenders. This meant supply lines stretched back to friendly territory, vulnerable to raids and disruption. What arrived was rarely fresh or appetizing. Salted meat that was more salt than meat. Hard bread that could chip teeth. Dried beans and peas boiled into tasteless mush. Fresh vegetables and fruit were luxuries that disappeared after the first week. Disease was the real killer in siege camps, with thousands of people living in close quarters, sharing water sources and dealing with inadequate sanitation. Illness spread like wildfire. Dysentery was common, the flux they called it, turning your bowels to water and leaving you weak, dehydrated, and desperately searching for the latrine trenches while hoping you'd make it in time. Typhus, spread by lice that infested everyone, caused high fevers and often death. More soldiers died from disease during medieval sieges than from actual combat. The daily routine was mind-numbingly boring. Guard duty watching the castle walls for signs of activity. Patrol duty making sure no one sneaked out to get supplies or sabotage your camp. Construction duty building siege engines, filling in moats, or digging approach trenches. All of this was hard labour performed in armour or at least heavy clothing, often in terrible weather, with the constant threat of being shot by defenders on the walls. Those defenders on the walls were a persistent danger. Archers would take pot shots at anyone who got too close or looked like an important target. You'd be walking across camp, minding your own business, and an arrow would zip past your head or, worse, hit someone standing next to you. These weren't sustained attacks, just opportunistic harassment designed to keep the besiegers nervous and remind them that getting close to the walls meant risking death. Building siege equipment was dangerous and time-consuming. Trebuchets, catapults, siege towers, battering rams, all of these required skilled craftsmen, raw materials, and weeks of construction. You'd need to cut down trees, shape timbers, fit pieces together, and test the mechanisms. All of this happened within range of the castle's defences, meaning workers were vulnerable to attack. Many siege weapons were destroyed by defender sallies. Sudden raids where the castle garrison would charge out, set fire to your half-built trebuchet, kill a few workers, and retreat before you could respond. The psychological warfare went both ways. Besiegers would parade captured prisoners in front of the walls, sometimes executing them to intimidate defenders. They'd fling propaganda messages over the walls, offering generous surrender terms or threatening horrible consequences. Defenders would shout insults, taunt the besiegers about their inevitable failure, and occasionally moon them from the battlements, because medieval psychological warfare included a surprising amount of crude humour. Mining was one of the most terrifying aspects of siege warfare. Engineers would dig tunnels under the castle walls, supporting the tunnel with wooden props as they went. Once they reached under the foundations, they'd pack the tunnel with flammable materials, set it on fire and retreat. The props would burn, the tunnel would collapse, and ideally, a section of wall would come crashing down. This process took weeks or months of dangerous underground work. Tunnel collapses, enemy counter-mining, and underground combat in pitch-black tunnels made this one of the most dreaded assignments. If you were inside the castle being besieged, your experience was different but equally terrible. At first, there might be optimism. The castle was well stocked, the walls were strong, surely relief forces would arrive, or the enemy would give up. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, that optimism would erode faster than the food supplies. Rationing began almost immediately. The castle's lord or commander would inventory all food, water and supplies, calculate how long they'd last and impose strict rations. Your daily portion would shrink steadily. First, you'd lose the fresh food, fruits, vegetables, fresh meat. Then the preserved foods would be rationed more strictly. Eventually you'd be eating things you'd never considered food before. Horses were usually slaughtered and eaten after a few weeks. They consumed too much and provided a lot of meat. Dogs and cats followed. Then rats became a food source. Ironic given that they were probably spreading the same diseases killing people, but hunger makes you less picky. In extreme sieges, people ate leather, boiled boots, and even resorted to cannibalism, though this was rare and usually hushed up afterward. Water was often more critical than food. Many castles had wells, but not all wells were deep enough or productive enough to supply everyone. Water would be rationed carefully, with priority given to fighters, while servants and non-combatants got less. If the well ran dry or was poisoned by enemy action, the siege was effectively over. You couldn't survive more than a few days without water. Morale inside a besieged castle deteriorated steadily. The constant stress, declining food, sickness and uncertainty about whether relief would ever come wore people down. Arguments broke out over rations, over strategy, over whether to surrender. Factions would form, those who wanted to hold out, and those who wanted to negotiate. The castle's lord had to manage these tensions while also organising the defence, a political and military nightmare. Defenders had to maintain constant vigilance. The enemy might attack at any time, dawn raids, nighttime assaults, attempts to scale the walls with ladders. Everyone took turns on watch, peering into the darkness, jumping at shadows, terrified that the next sound would be enemy soldiers pouring over the battlements. Sleep deprivation compounded the stress and malnutrition, creating a population of exhausted, paranoid, half-starved defenders. The enemy's siege weapons added another layer of terror. You'd hear the creaking of a trebuchet being loaded, then the release mechanism firing, then the whistling sound of a massive stone arc through the air. You'd have seconds to determine where it would land. If it hit the walls, the entire structure would shake. If it cleared the walls, it might crash through a roof, killing everyone inside. Some siege engines threw burning pitch or diseased animal carcasses, spreading fire and plague. Psychological warfare targeted the defenders too. Besiegers would display captured allies, announce false news about relief forces being defeated, or offer surrender terms that started generous and became steadily worse as time passed. Surrender now and you can leave with your lives. Wait another week and we'll only spare the nobles. Wait another month and everyone dies. These ultimatums created pressure to surrender before conditions improved. Defending against mining required counter-mining, digging your own tunnels to intercept the enemies. This led to underground battles fought in narrow, dark, half-collapsed tunnels, where you couldn't see your enemy, couldn't swing a sword properly, and could be buried alive at any moment if either tunnel collapsed. Men would fight with daggers and tools in absolute darkness, guided only by sound and touch, both sides terrified of cave-ins. Some defenders attempted sallies, charging out of the gates to disrupt siege operations, destroy siege engines, or capture supplies. These were desperate, dangerous operations. You'd throw open the gates, charge out with whatever force you could muster, accomplish your objective as quickly as possible, and retreat before the entire besieging army could respond. Many sallies ended with the attackers cut off and slaughtered, their bodies left as warnings. The end of a siege came in several ways. Sometimes relief forces arrived, attacking the besiegers from behind and breaking the siege. Sometimes the defenders ran out of everything and had no choice but to surrender. Sometimes the walls were breached and the castle was taken by storm, which usually ended very badly for the defenders, and sometimes the besiegers ran out of time, money, or soldiers and had to withdraw, giving the defenders an exhausting victory. Surrender negotiations were delicate and dangerous. The defenders wanted guarantees of safety and fair treatment. The besiegers wanted to punish the resistance and set an example. The longer the siege had lasted and the more it had cost the attackers, the worse the terms became. A castle that surrendered quickly might see its garrison freed and the nobility ransomed. A castle that held out for months might see everyone executed or enslaved. If the castle was taken by storm, walls breached or gates broken, the result was usually massacre. Besiegers who'd spent months in miserable conditions, losing friends to disease and arrows, would pour into the castle in a murderous rage. Defenders would be cut down, civilians caught in the violence, and the castle looted of everything valuable. This is why commanders often surrendered before it came to that, accepting bad terms to avoid total destruction. The aftermath of a siege, whether you won or lost, was grim. The besiegers would move on, leaving behind mass graves, ruined countryside, and traumatized local populations. The defenders, if they survived, would emerge to a devastated landscape with empty storerooms and months of reconstruction ahead. And everyone involved would carry the psychological scars, the hunger, the fear, the helplessness, the things they'd done to survive. Sieges were the ultimate test of endurance in medieval warfare. Not courage or skill, just endurance. Who could outlast whom? Who could survive on less? Who would break first? And through it all, whether you were inside or outside the walls, you were mostly just waiting, bored, hungry, sick, and terrified. Welcome to siege warfare, where the real enemy wasn't the opposing army. It was time. Here's a dirty little secret about knighthood. It wasn't profitable. Unless you owned land, which most knights didn't, you made your money by taking prisoners and ransoming them back to their families. Capturing a wealthy knight or noble in battle was like winning the lottery. You'd negotiate a price, hold them hostage, politely of course, and collect a hefty sum. But if you captured a peasant or a common soldier, tough luck. They were worthless. You'd either let them go or kill them because keeping them alive cost more than they were worth. The ransom system was the backbone of knightly economics. It transformed warfare from pure violence into a business opportunity. When two knights faced each other in battle, there was an unspoken calculation happening. Kill this enemy and gain nothing. Capture him and potentially make a year's income. This changed the dynamics of combat entirely. Knights would fight to disable and capture rather than kill, at least when fighting other nobles. The process began the moment you captured someone. You'd demand their immediate surrender and parole, their word of honour that they wouldn't escape or fight back. Most captured knights gave their parole because refusing meant being killed on the spot or tied up and dragged across battlefields until they changed their minds. Once they'd surrendered, you'd ask their name, title, and family connections to assess their ransom value. This identification process was crucial. Coat of arms, distinctive armour, and verbal confirmation all helped determine if you'd captured someone valuable or just another broke knight pretending to be important. Some knights lied about their identities, claiming to be wealthier than they were in hopes of better treatment, planning to reveal the truth later and negotiate down. Others downplayed their importance, hoping to be ransomed cheaply or released. If your prisoner was valuable, you'd take them back to your camp or castle and begin negotiations. This wasn't a quick process. Messages had to be sent to the prisoner's family, terms had to be discussed, guarantees had to be arranged. The whole thing could take months, during which you had to house, feed, and guard your prisoner. This was an investment of resources with no guarantee of payoff. The ransom amount was based on complex social calculations. Generally, you'd demand about 1 year of the prisoner's income, though this varied wildly. A wealthy duke might be ransomed for an enormous sum that would bankrupt his family and require selling lands. A minor knight might be ransomed for the equivalent of a good warhorse. The negotiations were delicate. Ask too much and the family couldn't pay, ask too little, and you'd look foolish or desperate. Treatment of prisoners varied based on their value and your temperament. High-value prisoners were often treated as guests, housed comfortably, allowed to keep servants, even invited to dine with their captors. This wasn't mercy, it was business. A well-treated prisoner was more likely to have their family pay quickly and fully. Mistreated prisoners might see their families drag out negotiations or refuse to pay, leaving you with an expensive, angry house guest. Lower-value prisoners had it worse. They'd be kept in actual cells, given minimal food, and treated more like criminals than honoured enemies. The calculus was simple. They weren't worth much, so why waste resources on comfort? Some captors would deliberately make conditions harsh to pressure prisoners into accepting unfavourable terms or convincing their families to pay faster. The honour system supposedly governed the entire process. A knight's word was binding. If you gave parole, you wouldn't escape. If you promised payment, you'd pay. Breaking your word meant social death. No one would ever trust you again. No one would ransom you if you were captured again, and you'd be marked as dishonourable throughout the nobility. This social pressure kept the system functioning even when legal enforcement was minimal. But honour only stretched so far. If a family couldn't pay, the prisoner was stuck. Some spent years in captivity, their families selling everything they owned to scrape together the ransom. Others were eventually released after paying a reduced amount, often ruined financially. A few were simply abandoned by families who decided they weren't worth bankrupting themselves over. These unfortunate souls might remain prisoners indefinitely, or be sold to other captors who'd try their own negotiations. The ransom market had specialists. Professional negotiators would act as intermediaries, brokers who knew the going rates and could facilitate deals. Moneylenders would offer loans to families who needed to raise ransoms quickly, charging extortionate interest rates. Some unscrupulous captors would sell their prisoners' ransoms to third parties, who then conduct negotiations, essentially creating a secondary market in captured nobles. King John of France provides a perfect example of the ransom system at its most extreme. Captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, his ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical sum that required France to implement new taxes and economic measures. John spent 4 years in comfortable English captivity, while his country bled itself financially to bring him home. When some of the ransom couldn't be paid and a hostage escaped, John voluntarily returned to English custody out of honour, where he eventually died. The ransom impoverished France for a generation. Multiple captures could utterly destroy a knight's finances. Get captured once, pay the ransom, fight again, get captured again. Suddenly you're in debt for life. Some knights became professional prisoners, captured so many times that they developed cynical familiarity with the process. They'd negotiate their own ransoms, maintain friendships with frequent captors, and treat the whole thing as an annoying business expense. The system created perverse incentives on the battlefield. Knights would sometimes fight less aggressively against wealthy opponents, hoping to capture rather than kill them. Battles would devolve into scuffles where everyone was trying to grab prisoners rather than actually win. Commanders had to issue specific orders to stop knights from breaking formation to chase valuable targets. Peasants and common soldiers had no place in this economy. They couldn't pay ransoms. Their families had no resources. Capturing them was pointless from a financial standpoint, so they were simply killed or released, depending on whether the captor felt merciful or couldn't be bothered to execute them. This created a battlefield where noblemen fought to capture each other, while everyone else fought to the death. The ransom system also meant that defeat in battle wasn't necessarily catastrophic for the nobility. You might lose, get captured, pay a ransom, and be back fighting in a few months. Meanwhile, the common soldiers on both sides were slaughtered by the thousands. Warfare for the nobility became almost civilized, a managed risk with financial consequences but relatively low chances of actual death. For everyone else, war remained brutally lethal. Some knights made entire careers out of ransom collecting. They'd target wealthy enemies in every battle, accumulate prisoners like investments, and negotiate multiple ransoms simultaneously. William Marshall, before he became a powerful noble, made his fortune capturing and ransoming enemies in tournaments and battles. He was so successful that he employed clerks just to keep track of his prisoner portfolio. The ethics of the ransom system were conveniently ignored. It was essentially kidnapping for profit, legally sanctioned and socially acceptable. Families were extorted under threat of their loved ones remaining imprisoned indefinitely. Yet because everyone participated and because it was limited to the nobility, it was considered normal, even honourable. The code of chivalry said nothing about the morality of holding people hostage for money. Disputes over ransom payments sometimes led to additional conflicts. A family might claim poverty and offer less than demanded. The captor might refuse and impose harsher conditions. Mediators might be brought in. Letters would fly back and forth. The whole process could become a secondary negotiation as complex as diplomatic treaties. Some ransom disputes lasted longer than the wars that created them. The ransom system also created insurance schemes. Groups of knights would form mutual aid societies, pooling money to help members pay ransoms if captured. This was medieval crowdfunding for prisoner release. You'd contribute regularly while free, knowing that if you were captured, the collective fund would help secure your release. It was practical, but also revealed the economic precarity of knighthood. Even the successful needed insurance against bankruptcy from capture. Women could be ransomed too, though this was less common since women rarely participated in combat. Noble women captured during sieges or raids could fetch substantial ransoms, sometimes more than male knights because their families often paid quickly to prevent any dishonour or mistreatment. This made women valuable hostages during conflicts, adding another layer of risk to the already dangerous experience of living in a war zone. The Church tried to regulate the ransom system with limited success. Clergy captured in warfare were supposed to be released without ransom, though this rule was frequently ignored. Priests and bishops were valuable prisoners, and captors weren't about to give up potential profit because of religious obligations. The captive clergy would protest, cite canon law, and eventually pay like everyone else. By the late medieval period, the ransom system was so established that it became formalized in military regulations. Armies had official ransom rates. Commanders took a percentage of all ransoms collected by their forces. Record keepers documented who captured whom and how much was owed. What had started as informal battlefield entrepreneurship had become bureaucratized military economy. The psychological impact of the ransom system shouldn't be underestimated. Knights fought knowing that defeat might mean financial ruin for their families. Capture created guilt. Your family would sacrifice to free you. Families of prisoners lived in anxiety, mortgaging property and taking loans they might never repay. The system touched everyone in the nobility, creating a shared economic vulnerability that shaped behaviour and decisions. For poor knights, those without land or wealthy families, the ransom system was terrifying. If you were captured, you were probably doomed. Your family couldn't pay. Your captor would realise you were worthless and might kill you, ransom you for a pittance that you still couldn't afford, or just keep you imprisoned indefinitely. Some poor knights fought with desperate ferocity because they knew capture meant death or permanent imprisonment. The ransom system ultimately revealed the truth about medieval warfare among the nobility. It was economic warfare dressed up in chivalric language. Knights weren't heroes pursuing glory. They were entrepreneurs pursuing profit. Battle was a business opportunity. Prisoners were assets, and the entire system existed to transfer wealth from captured knights' families to their captors while maintaining the fiction that everyone was behaving honourably. So yes, ransoms were how knights made money. It was kidnapping, extortion and hostage-taking, all perfectly legal and socially acceptable. It was the dirty financial foundation underneath all the chivalric pageantry. And it worked because everyone agreed to pretend it was honourable, rather than admitting it was just medieval organised crime with better PR. As a knight, you ate better than peasants, but that's an incredibly low bar. Your diet consisted mostly of bread, meat and ale. If you were at a feast, you might get roasted boar, venison, or swan served on platters with excessive ceremony. But day-to-day meals were far less exciting. Stale bread, salted meat that tasted like leather, and vegetables boiled into grey mush. Spices were rare and expensive. Fresh fruit rotted quickly, and everything tasted vaguely like smoke because every kitchen was just an open fire in a stone room. Let's start with bread, because bread was the foundation of every meal. Not the soft, fluffy bread you're imagining. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and made from whatever grain was available. Wheat if you were lucky, barley or rye if you weren't. The flour was ground with stone mills, which meant tiny bits of stone ended up in the bread, slowly grinding down your teeth over the years. This is why so many medieval skeletons have teeth worn flat by middle age. Bread also served as plates, trenchers they were called, thick slabs of stale bread that you'd pile food onto. The bread would soak up all the juices and grease, and at the end of the meal you'd either eat the soggy trencher yourself or give it to servants or the poor waiting outside. It was practical, but it also meant your plate tasted like yesterday's dinner, which was great when yesterday's dinner was roast meat, less great when it was fish. Meat was available more regularly to knights than to peasants, but the quality and freshness varied wildly. Fresh meat was a luxury because refrigeration didn't exist. Animals were slaughtered as needed, and the meat was consumed quickly before it spoiled. What wasn't eaten fresh was preserved, salted, smoked, or dried into something that technically qualified as edible but bore little resemblance to actual meat. Salted meat was the most common preserved option. The meat would be packed in salt, which drew out moisture and prevented bacterial growth. This worked for preservation but absolutely destroyed the flavour and texture. Salted pork or beef had to be soaked in water for hours before cooking to remove some of the salt, but it still tasted overwhelmingly salty and had the texture of shoe leather. You'd chew and chew and chew, your jaw aching, trying to break down meat that had been chemically transformed into something closer to jerky's angry cousin. Hunting provided fresh meat and was one of the privileges of knighthood. Deer, boar, rabbits. These were all game animals reserved for the nobility. But hunting wasn't just grabbing a bow and walking into the forest. It was an elaborate social ritual with rules, etiquette, and specific techniques. You'd spend all day chasing a deer with dogs and other knights, and if you were successful, you'd get a portion of the meat. If you weren't successful, you'd come home exhausted, hungry, and empty-handed. Fish was required eating on Fridays and throughout Lent. Church law forbade meat on these days. This sounds reasonable until you remember that fish in medieval terms included some questionable options. Fresh fish was fine if you lived near water, but inland castles received fish that had been transported for days, packed in salt or dried until it was rigid. This fish smelled terrible, tasted worse, and required serious cooking skills to make remotely palatable. The church's definition of fish was also creative. Beavers, because they had flat tails and lived in water, were classified as fish. So were barnacle geese, because medieval people believed they hatched from barnacles that grew on driftwood. These theological loopholes allowed nobles to eat meat-like animals on fast days while technically following church law. The reasoning was absurd but convenient. Vegetables were available but not particularly respected. They were seen as peasant food, filler for those who couldn't afford meat. Knights ate vegetables, but usually boiled into soups or pottages where they lost most of their texture, flavour, and nutritional value. Carrots, turnips, onions, cabbage, leeks, all boiled together into a grey-brown mush that tasted vaguely of whatever had been added to the pot. Fresh fruit was seasonal and spoiled quickly. Apples and pears in the fall, berries in summer, grapes when available. But fruit was often viewed with suspicion. Medieval medical theory suggested that raw fruit could cause illness by introducing too much moisture and cold into the body. Cooked fruit was considered safer, so many fruits were baked into pies or stewed until they were mushy and unrecognisable. Spices were the ultimate status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These came from distant lands and cost fortunes. A small jar of good pepper could cost as much as a sheep. Only the wealthy could afford to season their food with imported spices, and they did so excessively, partly for flavour and partly to show off. A dish absolutely loaded with cinnamon and ginger announced that you had money to burn. The lack of spices meant most food tasted bland, smoky, or overwhelmingly of whatever preservation method had been used. Salt, herbs like parsley and sage, and sometimes vinegar or verjuice, sour juice from unripe grapes, were the standard seasonings. These helped, but they couldn't transform old salted mutton into something delicious. They just made it slightly less terrible. Ale was the primary beverage because water was often unsafe to drink. Not the strong beer we know today. Medieval ale was weak, around 1–3% alcohol, consumed by everyone including children. It was safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed harmful bacteria. But it also meant you were mildly buzzed throughout the day, which probably helped make the food more tolerable. Wine was available but expensive. Good wine came from France and was reserved for the nobility and special occasions. Cheap wine tasted like vinegar and was sometimes cut with water or sweetened with honey to make it drinkable. Either way, you were drinking to survive more than to enjoy. The concept of pairing wine with food for flavour enhancement wasn't really a thing. Wine was nutrition and hydration that wouldn't kill you. Dairy products were part of the diet but problematic. Milk spoiled quickly, so it was usually consumed fresh by those who had access to cows or goats, or turned into cheese and butter for preservation. Cheese was a staple, hard, aged cheeses that could last for months. Butter was often rancid by the time you ate it because storage in warm conditions without refrigeration meant it went off quickly. Rancid butter tastes exactly as bad as it sounds. Meals were communal affairs in castles served in the Great Hall with strict attention to hierarchy and etiquette. The lord and important guests sat at the high table and got the best food. Lesser nobles and knights sat at lower tables and got progressively worse portions. Servants got the scraps. This meant the quality of your meal depended on your social position, and everyone could see exactly where you ranked by what was on your plate. Table manners were elaborate and specific. Use your knife to cut meat but eat with your fingers. Don't wipe your mouth on the tablecloth. Don't pick your teeth with your knife. Don't blow your nose into the shared hand-washing bowl. These rules existed because people did all of these things regularly and it grossed everyone out. Forks were rare and seen as affected foreign nonsense. Real men ate with their hands. Portions were generous if you were at the high table, but even large portions couldn't overcome the basic problem. Medieval food preservation and cooking techniques were limited. Without modern methods, most food was either fresh and delicious but rare, or preserved and terrible but available. You rarely got both quality and consistency. Feasts were the exception to everyday dining mediocrity. These elaborate multi-course affairs featured the best food available, prepared by skilled cooks and presented with theatrical flair. Whole roasted animals, elaborate meat pies, subtleties, decorative sculptures made from sugar or marzipan, musicians played, entertainers performed, multiple courses would be served over hours, but even feast food had issues. Everything was cooked over open fires, which meant temperature control was difficult. Meat might be charred on the outside and raw inside. Pies might be burnt or soggy. And because kitchens were separate buildings, everything arrived at the dining hall lukewarm at best. You'd be presented with a beautiful roasted peacock, reassembled with its feathers for display, only to bite into cold, dry bird meat that looked better than it tasted. The kitchens themselves were hellish workplaces. Open fires burning constantly, smoke filling the room, no ventilation, cooks working in extreme heat, managing multiple dishes simultaneously, all while dealing with unreliable ovens that were basically just hot boxes next to the fire. Burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation were occupational hazards. Kitchen workers had some of the hardest jobs in the castle. Food storage was primitive and ineffective. Grain was kept in barrels that could attract weevils and mice. Meat hung in larders that weren't cold enough to prevent spoilage. Vegetables were stored in root cellars that kept them cool but often damp, leading to rot. Lords employed tasters not just to check for poison, but to determine if food had gone bad before serving it to important people. Seasonal variation meant your diet changed dramatically throughout the year. Late summer and fall, after harvest, you'd eat relatively well, fresh produce, recently slaughtered animals, new grain. Winter was harder, preserved foods, dwindling supplies, anticipation of spring when stores would be nearly empty. Spring was the worst. The hungry months when last year's supplies were exhausted and new crops weren't ready. Even nobles ate poorly during late spring. Medical theories about food complicated everything. Physicians recommended foods based on your humoral balance, whether you needed warming or cooling, moistening or drying. This led to bizarre dietary advice that had nothing to do with actual nutrition. If you had a fever, you might be advised to avoid hot foods like meat and eat cold foods like lettuce, regardless of whether this actually helped. The wealthy sometimes developed gout and other diseases from their rich diets. Too much meat, too much alcohol, not enough vegetables or fibre. Meanwhile, even with better access to food than peasants, knights still suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Vitamin C deficiency caused scurvy on long campaigns. Lack of fresh vegetables meant digestive issues. The medieval diet, even for the privileged, was fundamentally unbalanced. Despite all these problems, knights ate significantly better than the majority of the population. Peasants survived on pottage, dark bread, and occasional vegetables. Knights had regular access to meat, better bread, and ale. This dietary difference was part of what maintained social hierarchy. You could literally see and taste the difference between social classes. So yes, as a knight, your food was better than a peasant's. You ate meat multiple times a week. You drank ale instead of questionable water. You got invited to feasts where swans were served with their feathers intact. But your everyday diet was still bland, frequently spoiled and cooked using methods that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. You just chewed your salted leather meat, swallowed your grey vegetable mush, washed it down with weak ale, and tried not to think about how much better food would taste about 7 centuries in the future. Let's be honest, knights were filthy. You wore the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks. You sweated constantly inside your armour. You slept in dirty beds, walked through muddy streets, and bathed maybe once a month if you were feeling ambitious. There was no deodorant, no soap that actually worked, and definitely no concept of germ theory. You just accepted that you smelled bad, everyone around you smelled bad, and life was generally a very fragrant experience. And don't even get me started on what happened when you had to pee inside your armour during a battle. Medieval attitudes toward bathing were complicated and often contradictory. Early in the medieval period, public bathhouses existed, and bathing was relatively common. But by the later Middle Ages, the Church began preaching that excessive bathing was sinful. It focused too much on the body, invited lustful thoughts, and opened your pores to disease. This last point was taken seriously. Medieval medical theory held that bathing opened your skin's pores, making you vulnerable to illness entering your body. So not bathing was actually considered healthier. When you did bathe, it was an elaborate production. You'd need servants to haul water from the well or stream, heat it over fires, and fill a wooden tub. This took hours of labour and enormous amounts of firewood. The water would be lukewarm at best by the time you got in, and multiple people would use the same bath water to avoid wasting all that effort. You'd climb into water that had already been used by your lord, your fellow knights, and possibly a servant or two. The phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," comes from this practice. By the time everyone had bathed, the water was so dirty you could lose a small child in it. Soap existed, but was harsh and ineffective. Made from animal fat and lye, it was better at removing skin than dirt. It smelled terrible, rancid fat mixed with caustic chemicals, and using it left your skin raw and irritated. Many people preferred to just scrub with cloths and hope for the best. Wealthy nobles might have access to imported soaps with pleasant scents, but these were luxury items far beyond a typical knight's budget. Your clothes were worn continuously until they literally fell apart. The arming doublet you wore under your armour would be soaked with sweat day after day. It would develop a crusty layer of dried salt, dirt, and body oils that made it stiff and rank. Washing clothes was difficult. You'd have to take them to a stream, beat them against rocks with lye soap, and hope they dried before the weather changed. Most knights owned only 1 or 2 changes of clothes, so washing meant going without until things dried, which in medieval climates could take days. The smell inside a castle was overwhelming. Imagine dozens or hundreds of people living in close quarters, most of them not bathing regularly, many of them wearing wool that had absorbed months of sweat. Add in the animals kept indoors, dogs, cats, sometimes horses or hawks. Add the smoke from constantly burning fires. The rushes on the floor that were supposed to be changed regularly but often weren't, accumulating food scraps, animal droppings and spilled liquids. The whole place smelled like a combination of unwashed bodies, wet dog, smoke, and decomposing organic matter. Your armour made everything worse. Once you strapped on 60 pounds of metal, you created a personal sauna. Sweat would pour off you, soaking into the padded doublet beneath. That sweat had nowhere to go. It just accumulated, creating a warm, moist environment perfect for bacteria. By the end of a day in armour, you'd be drenched, and the padding would be revolting. You couldn't wash it frequently without the padding falling apart, so it would dry, stiffen, and retain that special aroma of old sweat and metal. Dental hygiene was essentially non-existent. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss. Some people chewed on twigs or used cloths to rub their teeth, but this did almost nothing. Your teeth would accumulate plaque, develop cavities, and your gums would become inflamed. Bad breath was universal. Breath so bad that standing near someone during conversation was an assault on your senses. Add to this the medieval diet, heavy on meat and low on vegetables, and you had populations with spectacularly bad oral health. Handling bodily functions in armour presented special challenges. If you needed to urinate during a long day in armour, you had several bad options. You could try to remove enough armour pieces to access yourself, which took time and required help. You could use a small bottle or tube designed for this purpose, awkwardly manoeuvring it into position while wearing metal pants. Or you could just go in your armour and accept the consequences. Many knights chose option 3 during battles, when stopping to pee meant possibly dying. Going to the bathroom in castles was an adventure. The garderobe, medieval toilet, was a small closet with a hole in the floor that dropped waste down the exterior wall. There was no privacy, minimal shelter from wind, and the smell was horrific. The hole in the floor also meant cold air rushing up, which in winter turned bathroom visits into exercises in speed and determination. You'd do your business as quickly as possible and get out. Wiping was accomplished with whatever was available: moss, leaves, old rags, or wool scraps. Toilet paper wouldn't be invented for centuries. You'd use the same cloth multiple times before it was washed or discarded, which is exactly as unhygienic as it sounds. Hand washing after using the garderobe was rare because getting water required effort, and nobody really understood why it mattered. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Everyone had them. They lived in your hair, your clothes, and your bedding. You'd scratch constantly, leaving marks and sometimes infections. Lice removal was a social activity. People would sit and pick lice out of each other's hair, crushing them between their fingernails. This was bonding time. Nothing says friendship like mutual parasite removal. Bedbugs infested mattresses and bedding. They'd bite you while you slept, leaving itchy welts. You couldn't get rid of them. They were just part of life. The same bed you slept in would be crawling with insects and you'd just accept it. Sleeping was less about being comfortable, and more about being unconscious enough to not notice the bugs. Hair care was minimal. You'd rarely wash your hair. Doing so required the same amount of effort as a full bath. Your hair would become greasy, matted and full of dirt and debris. Some nobles used combs made of bone or wood to work through their hair, but this just redistributed the grease rather than removing it. Long hair was fashionable for men in some periods, which meant even more maintenance and even more smell. Shaving was dangerous and uncomfortable. Razors were basically sharp knives. You'd scrape them across your face without soap, lather, or anything to soften the hair. Cuts were common, infections from those cuts even more common. Many knights just grew beards to avoid the whole ordeal, resulting in facial hair that accumulated food, dirt, and general grime. Women had additional hygiene challenges. Menstruation was managed with cloth rags that would be washed and reused. No disposal products, no privacy, just cloth inserted or worn externally and changed when possible. Menstrual blood would stain clothes and bedding. The discomfort was compounded by the inability to bathe regularly or wash clothes easily. Medieval women dealt with this every month with minimal resources and no understanding of why it happened beyond religious explanations about Eve's sin. Wounds and injuries collected dirt easily. If you got cut in battle, the wound would be exposed to filth from your armour, your clothes, and the battlefield itself. Without antiseptics or sterile bandages, infections were extremely common. You'd clean wounds with wine or vinegar if available, but mostly you'd just wrap them in cloth and hope they healed. Many didn't. Minor cuts could become major infections, and infections could become sepsis and death. The concept of contagious disease existed but wasn't well understood. People knew that sick people could make others sick, but they didn't know how. They thought disease came from bad air, miasmas, or from imbalanced humours. So sick people were avoided, but there were no quarantine procedures, no hygiene protocols, no understanding that washing hands could prevent disease spread. Public spaces were disgusting. Streets were open sewers where people threw chamber pot contents, dead animals were left to rot, and mud mixed with human and animal waste to create a toxic sludge. Walking through medieval streets meant trudging through filth, which would splash onto your clothes and boots. You'd then track this into buildings, spreading contamination everywhere. Castle kitchens, despite preparing food for nobles, were not clean. Cooks worked with unwashed hands. Food was prepared on surfaces that had been used repeatedly without proper cleaning. Raw and cooked foods weren't separated. Meat might sit out for hours in warm kitchens. Flies buzzed everywhere. The fact that people survived medieval cuisine is testament to human resilience, not to food safety practices. Illness was constant and often linked to poor hygiene, though nobody made that connection. Skin infections, stomach problems, respiratory issues, all were more common and severe because of the filthy living conditions. Parasites were endemic. Intestinal worms infected most people at some point. Dysentery killed thousands. All of this could have been reduced with basic hygiene, but the knowledge simply didn't exist. Some attempts at personal care did exist. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and mint were used to mask body odour. Nobles might have servants wash their hands and face daily. Pomanders, small containers filled with aromatic substances, were carried to ward off bad smells and supposedly disease. These were better than nothing, but couldn't overcome the fundamental lack of cleanliness. The wealthy could afford slightly better hygiene, servants to draw baths, imported soaps, perfumes to mask smells, and multiple changes of clothes. But even the richest nobles still lived in conditions that would horrify modern people. Better than peasants wasn't the same as clean. It was just less dirty. Knights on campaign had it even worse than castle residents. Living in tents or open camps for weeks or months, no possibility of bathing, wearing the same clothes continuously, sleeping on the ground. You'd accumulate layers of grime, mud, blood, and other substances until you barely recognised yourself. Rivers and streams offered occasional washing opportunities, but cold water and no soap meant you were just wet and still dirty. The psychological adaptation to all this filth is remarkable. Modern people would be disgusted and overwhelmed by medieval hygiene standards. Medieval people just accepted it as normal. You stopped noticing your own smell. You stopped being bothered by everyone else's smell. The constant itching from parasites became background noise. You developed a tolerance for living conditions that would break modern sensibilities. So yes, as a knight, you were filthy. You smelled terrible. You itched constantly. Your teeth were rotting. Your clothes were disgusting. Your bedding was infested. And you just lived with it because everyone else did too, and because there was no alternative anyone knew about. Personal hygiene wasn't optional because you were lazy. It was optional because it was difficult, time-consuming, and according to medical understanding of the time, potentially harmful. You saved your energy for fighting, not for fighting grime. Welcome to medieval hygiene, where nobody was clean and everyone just dealt with it. If you were injured in battle, and you probably would be, your options for treatment were grim. Medieval medicine was a blend of superstition, guesswork, and occasional competence. Got a deep wound? They'd pour wine on it and hope for the best. Broke a bone? They'd set it poorly and you'd limp for the rest of your life. Infected cut? Time to amputate with a saw and no anaesthesia. And if you were really unlucky, they'd bleed you with leeches because they thought it balanced your humours. Spoiler, it didn't. Medieval medical theory was based on the idea of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humours were in balance. Sickness meant they were out of balance. Every treatment, every diagnosis, every explanation came back to humoral theory. It was elegant, comprehensive, and completely wrong. But since nobody knew about bacteria, viruses, or how the body actually worked, humoral theory was the best they had. When you got wounded in battle, the immediate treatment depended on who was available and where you were. If you were lucky, you'd have access to a barber surgeon, a medical practitioner who also cut hair because apparently those skills were related. If you were unlucky, you'd get treated by whoever was nearest and willing to help, which might be a fellow knight with no medical training whatsoever. The first step for any wound was stopping the bleeding. Battlefield medicine used cauterization, pressing red-hot iron to the wound to sear it shut. This was agonizing and often caused more damage than the original injury, but it did stop bleeding. Alternatively, they'd pack wounds with cloth or oakum, old rope fibres, which stopped blood flow but introduced dirt and bacteria directly into the wound. Infection was almost guaranteed. For deeper wounds, physicians might pour wine, vinegar, or boiling oil into the wound. Wine and vinegar actually had some antimicrobial properties, though nobody understood why. Boiling oil was just torture that usually made things worse. The screaming alone was memorable. Some military surgeons realized that gentler treatments worked better, but changing medical practice took centuries, and in the meantime, soldiers suffered through treatments that were nearly as bad as their injuries. Broken bones were set by feel and experience. The surgeon would manipulate the broken pieces back into alignment, splint the limb with wood and cloth, and hope everything healed properly. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. Bones would heal crooked, leaving you with permanent deformities and limited mobility. Compound fractures, where bone punctures through skin, were often death sentences. The combination of bone damage and infection was too much for medieval medicine to handle. Amputation was common and terrifying. If a limb was badly damaged or became infected, the solution was cutting it off before the infection spread and killed you. The procedure was brutal. You'd be held down by several strong men while the surgeon sawed through your limb with a bone saw. No anesthesia beyond alcohol or sometimes opium if you were extremely fortunate. Just raw agony while someone removed your arm or leg. Many patients died from shock during the procedure. More died afterward from infection or blood loss. The tools were primitive and reused without sterilization. Saws, knives, needles, all crusted with dried blood from previous patients. Nobody understood that this spread disease. Tools would be wiped off with a cloth and used on the next patient. Surgeons took pride in their blood-stained aprons. The more blood, the more experienced they appeared. This was exactly backward, but nobody knew better. Stitching wounds was done with thread made from animal gut or silk if available. The stitches themselves were functional, but introduced bacteria into already compromised tissue. Wounds would be dressed with cloth bandages that weren't clean, creating perfect conditions for infection. The bandages would be changed occasionally, though not frequently enough, and the wound would be checked for signs of healing or corruption, the medieval term for infection. Infections were deadly and poorly understood. When a wound became infected, it would swell, turn red, fill with pus, and cause fever. Medieval physicians recognized these signs, but thought they indicated the body cooking the bad humours. Pus was actually considered good, laudable pus they called it, believing it showed the body expelling corrupted material. So they'd leave infected wounds alone, watching them worsen while praising the healing process. Some infections led to gangrene, where tissue died and turned black. This was recognized as very bad, and usually led to amputation. But by the time gangrene was obvious, the infection had often spread too far. Patients would die of sepsis, system-wide infection, within days. There was no treatment. You either survived your body's response to the infection or you didn't. Bloodletting was the universal treatment for almost everything. Fever, bloodletting. Infection, bloodletting. Plague, bloodletting. The theory was that illness meant you had too much blood, so removing some would restore balance. Physicians would make cuts in your arms or legs and drain blood into bowls, sometimes taking significant amounts. This weakened already sick patients and absolutely did not help. But it was standard practice for centuries. Leeches were another bloodletting method. Medical leeches would be applied to your skin where they'd attach and suck blood. Physicians believed this was more targeted than cutting because leeches could be placed on specific body parts. After the leeches were full, they'd detach or be removed. This was less traumatic than cutting, but equally ineffective and carried the risk of infection from the leech bite. Herbal remedies were part of every physician's toolkit. Some actually worked. Willow bark contained salicylic acid, similar to aspirin. Others did nothing. Many were actively harmful. Without scientific testing, there was no way to distinguish effective herbs from useless or dangerous ones. Remedies were based on tradition, superstition, and the doctrine of signatures, the belief that plants resembled the body parts they could heal. This led to some truly bizarre treatments. Pain management was primitive. Alcohol was the most common option. Drink until you're drunk enough to not care about the pain. Opium was available but expensive and rare. Some physicians used mandrake root or henbane, which contained alkaloids that reduced pain but also caused hallucinations and could kill you with incorrect dosing. Most people just endured pain with no relief whatsoever. Head injuries were particularly dangerous. Concussions weren't understood. Knights would be knocked unconscious, wake up confused and dizzy, and be sent back into battle because nobody recognized brain trauma. Repeated concussions caused permanent damage, memory problems, personality changes, chronic headaches. These were accepted as normal consequences of knighthood, not preventable medical conditions. Skull fractures sometimes required trepanation, drilling or scraping holes in the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits, depending on which physician you asked. Surprisingly, some patients survived this. The survival rate was terrible, but the fact that anyone survived having their skull drilled open with medieval tools is remarkable. Of course, the infection rate was nearly 100%, so survival wasn't guaranteed even if you made it through the procedure. Internal injuries were mystery boxes. If you were hit in the abdomen and started vomiting blood, physicians knew you were probably dying but couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't see inside your body. They didn't understand internal organs well enough to diagnose specific injuries. You'd be given prayers, last rites, and maybe some wine for the pain while everyone waited to see if you'd recover or die. Battlefield surgeons developed some practical skills through sheer experience. They learned to remove arrows carefully, though the techniques varied. Some would push the arrow through and out the other side. Others would cut down to the arrowhead and extract it. Both methods were agonizing and risky. Barbed arrows were particularly problematic. Pulling them back out tore through flesh and caused massive additional damage. Disease killed more knights than combat. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was endemic in military camps. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close living conditions spread it rapidly. You'd have severe diarrhea, dehydration, cramping, and fever. Treatment was ineffective. Many physicians recommended binding your bowels to stop the diarrhea, which didn't address the underlying infection, and sometimes made things worse. You either recovered naturally or died, which many did. Typhus, spread by lice that infested everyone, caused high fever, headache, and often death. There was no treatment. Plague outbreaks would sweep through armies, killing thousands in weeks. Physicians had no idea these diseases were caused by microorganisms. They blamed bad air, divine punishment, or humoral imbalances. None of their treatments worked. Dental problems were excruciating and poorly treated. Tooth extraction was the solution for any dental pain. A barber surgeon would grab the tooth with pliers and yank it out. No numbing, no gentle technique, just brute force. Sometimes the tooth would break, leaving roots behind to continue causing pain and infection. Sometimes the jaw would fracture during extraction. Dental abscesses could spread infection to your brain, killing you from a bad tooth. Eye injuries were common in combat. Splinters from shattered lances, sword strikes that caught the face, arrows that penetrated visors. Many knights lost eyes. The treatment was removing the damaged eye with minimal ceremony and stitching the socket closed. Some physicians would pack the socket with herbs or caustic substances that supposedly prevented infection, but usually just caused more damage. Wearing an eye patch became common among veteran knights. Chronic pain was universal among older knights. Years of wearing armour, taking blows and suffering injuries led to arthritis, back problems, and joint damage. There was no treatment. You lived with constant pain, managed it with alcohol or herbs if you could afford them, and gradually became less mobile. Many elderly knights were crippled by accumulated damage, their bodies broken by a career of violence. The psychological toll of injury was ignored entirely. Today we'd recognise PTSD, depression, and anxiety in traumatised soldiers. Medieval medicine had no concept of mental health beyond humoral imbalances. Knights who couldn't sleep, who had nightmares, who developed drinking problems or became violent, these were seen as character flaws or demonic possession, not treatable conditions. Despite all these limitations, some patients did recover. Human bodies are remarkably resilient. The immune system would sometimes overcome infections. Broken bones would heal, albeit crooked. Wounds would close on their own despite terrible treatment. The ones who survived did so largely despite medical intervention. not because of it. The best medical advice was actually the simplest: don't get hurt. Knights who avoided injury lived longer than those who endured medieval medical treatment. Prevention was the only reliable strategy, though in a profession centred on violence, avoiding injury wasn't really an option. So yes, if you were injured as a medieval knight, your options were prayer, pain, and primitive medical intervention that might kill you faster than your wound. You'd be treated by someone with minimal training using contaminated tools and ineffective theories. Your pain would be unmanaged, your infection would be misunderstood, and your survival would depend primarily on luck. Welcome to medieval medicine, where the treatment was often worse than the disease and death was always a likely outcome. You couldn't escape the church. Religion was woven into every aspect of knightly life. You prayed before battles, you attended mass regularly, you swore oaths on holy relics, and if you wanted to be seen as a proper honourable knight, you'd better show public devotion or risk being labelled a heretic. The church also had opinions on warfare, just war theory, rules of combat, when you could and couldn't fight. And if you violated those rules, you risked excommunication, which in medieval terms was a fate worse than death. Your day began with prayer. Before breakfast, before training, before anything else, you were expected to attend morning prayers or mass in the castle chapel. This wasn't optional. Missing morning prayers without a very good reason, like actively bleeding to death, would be noticed and remarked upon. Your reputation for piety was as important as your reputation for martial skill. Maybe more important, since the church controlled access to heaven and knights, given their violent profession, were particularly anxious about their eternal souls. Mass was conducted in Latin, which most knights didn't understand. You'd stand there, kneel at appropriate moments, make the sign of the cross when others did, and mouth along to prayers you'd memorized phonetically without knowing what they meant. The priest would give a sermon, possibly in the local language, usually about sin, hell, and the importance of obedience to the church. You'd listen, or pretend to listen, trying not to fall asleep after a long night of guard duty. The sacraments marked every important moment in your life. Baptism at birth, confession regularly to cleanse your soul of sins, Eucharist, receiving communion, to maintain your connection to Christ. Marriage, blessed by the church and treated as a sacred bond you couldn't break. And finally, last rites when you were dying, to prepare your soul for judgment. Miss any of these and your soul was in jeopardy. Confession was particularly important for knights. You killed people for a living, which was definitely a sin. But the church had worked out a complicated system where killing in just wars or in defence of Christendom wasn't sinful, or at least was forgivable. You'd confess your sins to a priest, not just the killing, but also the lying, stealing, lustful thoughts, and everything else you'd done. The priest would assign penance, usually prayers or charitable donations, and absolve you. Then you'd go out and do it all again. Swearing oaths was sacred business. Your word, given on holy relics or in the presence of God, was binding. Breaking an oath was both a social catastrophe and a mortal sin. When you became a knight, you swore oaths of loyalty to your lord and to God. When you made agreements, you swore oaths. When you promised ransom payment, you swore oaths. The religious nature of these promises gave them power. Breaking your word meant damning your soul, which was a powerful deterrent in an age when everyone believed in literal hell. The church's rules about warfare created constant complications. You couldn't fight on Sundays or holy days, which were numerous. Fighting during Lent, Advent, or other religious seasons was forbidden. This meant warfare operated on a schedule dictated by the church calendar. Campaigns would pause for religious observances, then resume afterward. Enemies who attacked during prohibited times were condemned as impious, though this didn't stop anyone from doing it when strategically advantageous. Just war theory was the church's attempt to regulate when violence was acceptable. Wars had to have just cause, defending territory, punishing evil, serving the church. They had to be declared by proper authorities, kings and nobles, not random knights starting feuds. They had to be fought with right intention, for justice, not greed or glory. And they had to use proportionate means, no excessive violence or unnecessary cruelty. In practice, Every war was declared just by whoever started it, and the rules were ignored whenever convenient. Crusades were the ultimate expression of religious warfare. The Church promised that crusaders, knights who fought to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, would receive full forgiveness of their sins. This was an incredible offer. You could murder, pillage, and commit every sin imaginable during your normal life, but join a crusade and your slate was wiped clean. Many knights took crusade vows not from piety but from calculation. It was eternal life insurance. The reality of crusading was less holy than advertised. Crusaders committed atrocities against Muslims, Jews, and even other Christians. The Fourth Crusade famously sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, because it was convenient and profitable. Crusaders fought less for religious conviction and more for land, loot, and adventure. But they all wore crosses on their surcoats and claimed divine mission, which made the violence somehow acceptable. Excommunication was the Church's nuclear option. If you seriously violated church law or defied ecclesiastical authority, you could be excommunicated, cut off from the Church and its sacraments. This meant no confession, no communion, no Christian burial when you died. Your soul would go to hell. Nobody would do business with you. Your vassals might be released from their oaths. Excommunication could destroy your life and damn your soul simultaneously. The threat of excommunication gave the Church enormous power over secular authorities. Kings and nobles who defied the Pope risked not just their own souls but political instability. Interdict, excommunication of an entire region, was even more devastating. The Church would refuse to perform services anywhere in the affected territory. No marriages, baptisms, or funerals. This created popular pressure on rulers to comply with Church demands. Relics were objects of intense devotion and power. A saint's bone, a piece of the true cross, a vial of holy blood. These were considered conduits to divine power. Knights swore oaths on relics, carried them into battle for protection, and donated to churches that housed important relics. The authenticity of most relics was questionable at best. There were enough pieces of the true cross to build several crosses, but belief was what mattered. Pilgrimage was both spiritual exercise and penance. Knights who'd committed serious sins might be ordered to make pilgrimages to holy sites: Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela. These journeys took months or years, cost enormous amounts of money, and were genuinely dangerous. But completing a pilgrimage demonstrated sincere repentance and could restore your reputation while hopefully saving your soul. The Church's position on violence created cognitive dissonance. Christianity preached peace, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek. Knights' entire existence was based on violence and martial prowess. The Church resolved this by creating categories of acceptable violence, defending the innocent, fighting infidels, punishing evildoers. Knights could be Christians and warriors simultaneously if they followed the right rules and killed the right people. Monasteries and military orders offered an alternative path for religious knights. The Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights were religious military orders, monks who were also warriors. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like regular monks, but their mission was martial. They fought crusades, protected pilgrims, and accumulated enormous wealth and power. Joining a military order meant dedicating your violent skills to God's service, which appealed to knights worried about their souls. Religious imagery saturated knightly culture. Swords were shaped like crosses, a constant reminder of Christian faith. Armour was blessed by priests before battle. Banners bore religious symbols. Battle cries invoked saints. The entire martial culture was wrapped in Christian symbolism, transforming violence into holy work. This wasn't hypocrisy exactly. It was genuine belief that warfare could serve God's purposes. The fear of hell was real and constant. Medieval Christianity taught that hell was a place of eternal physical torment, burning in fire forever, never dying, never escaping. Demons would torture you creatively and endlessly. This wasn't metaphor. People believed this literally. And knights, whose profession involved killing, were particularly vulnerable. Every death you caused, every sin you committed, added weight to your soul. Prayer, confession, and good works could lighten that weight. But you were never sure if you'd done enough. Heaven was the goal, but achieving it was uncertain. Even living a good life didn't guarantee salvation. You needed God's grace, which was dispensed mysteriously according to divine plan. This created anxiety that the church exploited. Want to improve your chances? Donate to the church, fund a monastery, go on crusade, buy indulgences, pieces of paper that promised reduced time in purgatory. The church had monetized salvation, and knights, desperate for heavenly mercy, paid. Saints were intermediaries between humans and God. Knights had patron saints they prayed to for protection and intercession. St. Michael for warriors, St. George for knights, St. Sebastian for soldiers. You'd pray to these saints before battle, asking them to intercede with God on your behalf. If you survived, you'd give thanks and maybe donate to a church dedicated to that saint. It was transactional spirituality, divine protection in exchange for devotion and payment. Religious festivals provided breaks from warfare and training. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. These major holidays meant feasting, celebration, and temporary peace. Even in the middle of campaigns, most armies would observe Christmas truces. Fighting on Christmas was considered especially impious. These breaks were religiously mandated rest periods in a life of constant violence. The church's control over marriage affected knights significantly. The church determined who could marry whom, based on complicated rules about consanguinity, blood relationships. Cousins couldn't marry, or second cousins, or sometimes even more distant relations. This limited marriage options for nobility who were all distantly related. But the church would grant dispensations, official permission to marry despite the rules, for a fee. More monetization of religious authority. Illegitimate children were a religious problem. Knights often fathered children outside marriage, with servants, peasants, or women encountered during campaigns. These bastard children couldn't inherit titles or lands, couldn't become knights themselves without special dispensation, and were marked by the sin of their conception. Some knights acknowledged and supported their illegitimate children. Others abandoned them completely. The church condemned extramarital sex while recognizing the reality that it happened constantly. Death was the ultimate religious moment. A knight's death needed to be properly managed to ensure salvation. Last rites were essential. A priest would hear your final confession, give communion, and anoint you with holy oil. Dying without last rites meant your soul's fate was uncertain. Knights wounded in battle would desperately try to survive long enough to receive last rites, or beg nearby priests to perform the sacrament even while fighting continued around them. Burial in consecrated ground was crucial. Your body needed to be buried in a churchyard blessed by a priest to await resurrection at the end of times. Excommunicated people, heretics, and suicides couldn't be buried in holy ground. They'd be dumped outside the churchyard walls. Knights who died in tournaments or from mortal sins sometimes faced this fate, though families often bribed priests to overlook the circumstances. The church's influence was total and inescapable. It structured your day, your year, your entire life. It determined morality, legality, and social acceptability. It offered the only path to eternal salvation, and wielded the threat of eternal damnation. You couldn't be a knight without being a Christian, and being a Christian meant constant engagement with church authority, doctrine, and demands. So, yes, religion was mandatory. It was all-consuming. It justified your violence while condemning your sins. It offered salvation while demanding payment. It gave meaning to your brutal existence while threatening punishment for that same brutality. You prayed because you had to, because everyone was watching, and because deep down you believed that somewhere beyond this violent, painful world there might be peace. And given what your life was like, that promise of eventual peace was the only thing that kept you going. So, how was your day as a medieval knight? You woke up in a cold, drafty castle. You strapped yourself into 70 pounds of metal that turned you into a walking oven. You climbed onto a horse that cost more than most people's houses and could kill you if it felt moody. You fought in battles that were nothing like the songs promised, just chaos, mud, screaming, and someone trying to stab you in the armpit. You ate food that was either spoiled, oversalted, or boiled into grey mush. You never bathed. You itched constantly from lice. Your teeth were rotting out of your head. And if you got injured, the medical treatment was probably worse than just bleeding out quietly in a ditch. You spent a fortune you didn't have on equipment that required constant maintenance. You risked your life in tournaments for prizes that didn't cover your expenses. You followed a code of chivalry that everyone ignored. You captured enemies for ransom because it was the only way to make money, and even then, you'd probably die broke. You lived in castles that were freezing in winter and stifling in summer, surrounded by people who smelled as bad as you did, eating meals that tasted like smoke and disappointment. And through it all, you prayed. You prayed before battles, after battles, and during battles when you thought you were about to die. You attended mass in languages you didn't understand. You swore oaths on relics. You worried constantly about your immortal soul because your entire profession involved killing people, and you weren't entirely sure God was okay with that despite what the priest kept saying. But here's the thing about medieval knights. They endured. They took all of this, the discomfort, the danger, the debt, the dirt, and they kept going. They trained for years to master skills that would leave them crippled by middle age. They wore armour that slowly destroyed their bodies. They fought in wars they didn't start for causes they didn't choose, and somehow they found meaning in it. Not because knighthood was glorious, it wasn't. Not because it was profitable, it definitely wasn't. But because it was their world, and they were determined to survive it with whatever dignity they could scrape together. They turned suffering into stories. They transformed violence into virtue, at least in the songs. They created a mythology around themselves that was so powerful it's still with us today, even though the reality was nothing like the myth. Medieval knights weren't heroes. They were just people trying to make it through a world that was brutally hard on everyone, but especially hard on professional warriors who'd chosen a path that was expensive, painful, and usually short. They were products of their time, violent, hierarchical, deeply flawed, but they were also human, which meant they laughed, loved, hoped, and feared just like anyone else. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed with its memory foam mattress and clean sheets, in your temperature-controlled room with working plumbing and electric lights, maybe spare a thought for the medieval knight. Shivering in his drafty castle, wearing clothes he hasn't washed in weeks, eating bread hard enough to break teeth, and wondering if tomorrow's battle will be the one that finally kills him or just leaves him maimed and bankrupt. You wouldn't have lasted a day in his world, but you don't have to, because he endured it so that eventually generations later we could live in one where armour is optional, medicine works, and you can take a hot shower whenever you want. The age of knights is long over. The castles are ruins. The armour is in museums. The code of chivalry is a punchline. But their story remains. Not the polished fairy tale version, but the real one. Dirty, painful, complicated, and utterly human. So let them rest now, these long-dead warriors in their cold tombs. They've earned it. They fought their battles, survived their world, and left behind enough stories to fill 1,000 nights. And you just get to sleep peacefully, warm and safe, grateful that you'll never have to wear a helmet that makes you functionally deaf and blind, or eat salted meat that tastes like a leather boot, or explain to your squire why your armour smells like you've been marinating in it for 3 weeks. Sweet dreams, and be glad you're not a knight.